Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I'm going to read a book that I read a while back, but I think is a very important historical document. The title of the document is A Psychological Analysis of Adolf Hitler, His Life and Legend, compiled by Walter C. Langer for Bill Donovan in 1943 for the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. It's a formerly secret document that was declassified in 1999, although you can find it in different variations or versions. I think now it's in a book titled The Mind of Adolf Hitler. But it was something that was written and compiled from a variety of sources. It was actually based upon a 1,000-page book called the Hitler Source Book, which is a compilation of all kinds of material that was put together, provided to the psychologists, not just Walter C. Langer, but also Henry A. Murray, Ernst Kriss, and Bertram D. Lewin. And then they went through it and analyzed all these people, based upon all these people. And it's a very fascinating document and looks into the psychology of Adolf Hitler. And it made several accurate predictions that there would be an attempted assassination of him by the German aristocracy, and also that he would attempt suicide in defeat. And this psychological profile style was something that the CIA would later use on other rival political figures such as Nikita Khrushchev, Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and Fidel Castro. My intent is to read the entire document, the entire 176 pages, but in the document there are quotations that are only in German, so I've gone through the trouble to translate those and in the best kind of translation that I can make of the original German that's in the Langer report. So, again, the title of the document is A Psychological Analysis of Adolf Hitler, His Life and Legend by Walter C. Langer, the MO branch of the Office of Strategic Services, Washington, D.C. Preface. This study is not propagandistic in any sense of the term. It represents an attempt to screen the wealth of contradictory, conflicting, and unreliable material concerning Hitler into strata which will be helpful to the policymakers and those who wish to frame a counter-propaganda. For this reason, the first three parts are purely descriptive and deal with the man, 1, as he appears to himself, 2, as he has been pictured to the German people, and 3, as he is known to his associates. These sections contain the basic material for the psychological analyses in sections 4 and 5, in which an attempt is made to understand Hitler as a person and the motivations underlying his actions. The material available for such an analysis is extremely scant and spotty. Fortunately, we have had at our disposal a number of informants who knew Hitler well and who would have been willing to cooperate to the best of their abilities. The study would have been entirely impossible were it not for the fact that there is a relatively high degree of agreement in the description of Hitler's behavior, sentiments, and attitudes given by these several informants. With this as a basis, it seemed worthwhile to proceed with the study, filling in the lacunae with knowledge gained from clinical experience in dealing with individuals of a similar type. This is not an entirely satisfactory procedure from a scientific point of view, but it is the only feasible method at the present time. Throughout the study, we have tried to be as objective as possible in evaluating his strengths as well as his weaknesses. All plain numbers in parentheses refer to the page of the Hitler Source Book, a companion volume in which the original material is found together with the complete reference. Numbers in parentheses preceded by MK or MNO refer to pages in Mein Kampf or My New Order respectively. A detailed index to the original material is to be found at the beginning of the source book. A complete bibliography is appended to this study. It is hoped that the study may be helpful in gaining a deeper insight into Adolf Hitler and the German people, and that it may serve as a guide for our propaganda activities as well as our future dealings with them. Walter C. Langer, Consultant, MO Branch, OSS. Part 1. Hitler as he believes himself to be. At the time of the reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936, Hitler made use of an extraordinary figure of speech in describing his own conduct. He said, quote, "I follow my course with the precision and security of a sleepwalker," unquote. Even at that time, it struck the world as an unusual statement for the undisputed leader of 67 million people to make in the midst of an international crisis. Hitler meant it to be a kind of reassurance for his more wary followers who questioned the wisdom of his course. It seems, however, that it was a true confession, and had his wary followers only realized its significance and implications, they would have had grounds for far greater concern than that aroused by his proposal to reoccupy the Rhineland. For the course of this sleepwalker has carried him over many untraveled roads, which finally led him unerringly to a pinnacle of success and power never reached before. And still it lured him on until today he stands on the brink of disaster. He will go down in history as the most worshipped and the most despised man the world has ever known. Many people have stopped and asked themselves, quote, "Is this man sincere in his undertakings, or is he a fraud?" Unquote. Certainly, even a fragmentary knowledge of his past life warrants such a question, particularly since our correspondents have presented us with many conflicting views. At times it seemed almost inconceivable that a man could be sincere and do what Hitler has done in the course of his career. And yet all of his former associates, whom we have been able to contact, as well as many of our most capable foreign correspondents, are firmly convinced that Hitler actually does believe in his own greatness. Fuchs reports that Hitler said to Schuschnigg during the Berchtesgaden interviews, quote, "Do you realize that you are in the presence of the greatest German of all time?" It makes little difference for our own purpose whether he actually spoke these words or not at this particular time, as alleged. In this sentence he has summed up in a very few words an attitude to which he has expressed to some of our informants in person. To Rauschning, for example, he once said, quote, "I don't play war. I do not allow myself to be commanded by generals. I am waging war, the actual good, and I will wait for him. At the iron time, I determine the attack. There is only one opportunity, and I won't miss it." And it seems to be true that he has made a number of contributions to German offensive and defensive tactics and strategy. He believes himself to be an outstanding judge in legal matters and does not blush when he stands before the Reichstag while speaking to the whole world and says, quote, "For the last 24 hours I was the Supreme Court of the German people," unquote. Then, too, he believes himself to be the greatest of all German architects and spends a great deal of his time in sketching new buildings and planning the remodeling of entire cities. In spite of the fact that he failed to pass the examinations for admission to the art school, he believes himself to be the only competent judge in this field. A few years ago he appointed a committee of 3 to act as final judges on all matters of art, but when their verdicts did not please him, he dismissed them and assumed their duties himself. It makes little difference whether the field be economics, education, foreign affairs, propaganda, movies, music, or women's dress. In each and every field he believes himself to be an unquestioned authority. He prides himself on his hardness and brutality. Quote, "I am one of the hardest men Germany has had for decades, perhaps for centuries, equipped with the greatest authority of any German leader. But above all, I believe in my success. I believe in it unconditionally," unquote. This belief in his own power actually borders on a feeling of omnipotence, which he is not reluctant to display. Quote, "Since the events of last year, his faith in his own genius and his instinct, as one might say, in his star is boundless. Those who surround him are the first to admit that he now thinks himself infallible and invincible. That explains why he can no longer bear either criticism or contradiction. To contradict him in his eyes is a crime of lèse majesté. Opposition to his plans, from whatever side it may come, is a definite sacrilege, to which the only reply is an immediate and striking display of his omnipotence." That's from the French Yellow Book. Another diplomat reports a similar impression. Quote, "When I first met him, his logic and sense of realities had impressed me, but as time went on, he appeared to me to become more and more unreasonable and more convinced of his own infallibility and greatness." There seems to be little room for doubt concerning Hitler's firm belief in his own greatness. We must now inquire into the sources of this belief. Almost all writers have attributed Hitler's confidence to the fact that he is a great believer in astrology and that he is constantly in touch with astrologers who advise him concerning his course of action. This is almost certainly untrue. All of our informants who have known Hitler rather intimately discard the idea as absurd. They all agree that nothing is more foreign to Hitler's personality than to seek help from outside sources of this type. The informant of the Dutch legation holds a similar view. He says, quote, "Not only has the Führer never had his horoscope cast, but he is in principle against horoscopes because he feels he might be unconsciously influenced by them," unquote. It is also indicative that Hitler, for some time before the war, forbade the practice of fortune-telling and star-reading in Germany. It is true that it looks as though Hitler might be acting under some guidance of this sort which gives him the feeling and conviction of his own infallibility. These stories probably originated in the very early days of the party. According to Strasser, during the early 1920s, Hitler took regular lessons in speaking and mass psychology from a man named Hanussen, who was also a practicing astrologer and fortune teller. He was an extremely clever individual who taught Hitler a great deal concerning the importance of staging meetings to obtain the greatest dramatic effect. As far as can be learned, he never had any particular interest in the movement or any say on what course it should follow. It is possible that Hanussen had some contact with a group of astrologers referred to by von Wiegand, who were very active in Munich at this time. Although Hitler too may have come in contact with this group, for von Wiegand writes, quote, "When I first knew Adolf Hitler in Munich in 1921 and 1922, he was in touch with a circle that believed firmly in the portents of the stars. There was much whispering of the coming of another Charlemagne and a new Reich. How far Hitler believed in these astrological forecasts and prophecies in those days I never could get out of Der Führer. He neither denied nor affirmed belief. He was not adverse, however, to making use of the forecast to advance popular faith in himself and his then young and struggling movement. It is quite possible that from these beginnings the myth of his associations with astrologers has grown. Although Hitler has done considerable reading in a variety of fields of study, he does not in any way attribute his infallibility or omniscience to any intellectual endeavor on his part. On the contrary, he frowns on such sources when it comes to guiding the destiny of nations. His opinion of the intellect is, in fact, extremely low, for in various places he makes such statements as the following, quote, "Of secondary importance is the training of mental abilities. Overeducated people, stuffed with knowledge and intellect, but bare of any sound instincts. These impudent rascals, intellectuals who always know everything better than everybody else. The intellect has grown autocratic and has become a disease of life," unquote. Hitler's guide is something different entirely. It seems certain that Hitler believes that he has been sent to Germany by Providence and that he has a particular mission to perform. He is probably not clear on the scope of this mission beyond the fact that he has been chosen to redeem the German people and reshape Europe. Just how this is to be accomplished is also rather vague in his mind, but this does not concern him greatly because an inner voice communicates to him the steps he is to take. This is the guide which leads him on his course with the precision and security of a sleepwalker. Quote, "I carry out the commandments that Providence has laid upon me. No power on earth can shake the German Reich now. Divine Providence has willed it that I carry through the fulfillment of the Germanic task. But if the voice speaks, then I know the time has come to act," unquote. It is this firm conviction that he has a mission and is under the guidance and protection of Providence which is responsible in large part for the contagious effect he has had on the German people. Many people believe that this feeling of destiny and mission have come to Hitler through his successes. This is probably false. Later in our study, Part 5, we will try to show that Hitler has had this feeling for a great many years, although it may not have become a conscious conviction until much later. In any case, it was forcing its way into consciousness during the last war and has played a dominant role in his actions ever since. Mend, one of his comrades, for example, reports, quote, "I do not remember a narrow prophecy in this context. Shortly before Christmas 1915, he told himself that we would still hear a lot from him. We should just wait until his time has come," unquote. Then, too, Hitler has reported several incidents during the war which proved to him that he was under divine protection. The most startling of these is the following. Quote, "I was eating my dinner in a trench with several comrades. Suddenly a voice seemed to be saying to me, 'Get up and go over there.' It was so clear and insistent that I obeyed automatically, as if it had been a military order. I rose at once to my feet and walked 20 yards along the trench, carrying my dinner in its tin can with me. Then I sat down to go on eating, my mind being once more at rest. Hardly had I done so when a flash and a deafening report came from the part of the trench I had just left. A stray shell had burst over the group in which I had been sitting, and every member of it was killed," unquote. Then also there was the vision he had while in hospital at Pasewalk, suffering from blindness, allegedly caused by gas. Quote, "As I lay in bed, it occurred to me that I was going to liberate Deutschland, that I would grow up, and I knew immediately that this would be realized." These experiences must later have fit in beautifully with the views of the Munich astrologers, and it is possible that underneath Hitler felt that if there was any truth in their predictions, they probably referred to him. But in those days he did mention any connection between them or dwell on the divine guidance he believed he possessed. Perhaps he felt that such claims at the beginning of the movement might hinder rather than help it. However, as von Wiegand has pointed out, he was not averse to making use of the forecast to advance his own ends. At that time, he was content with the role of a drummer who was heralding the coming of the real Savior. Even then, however, the role of drummer was not as innocent or as insignificant in Hitler's mind as might be supposed. This was brought out in his testimony during the trial following the unsuccessful beer hall putsch of 1923. At that time he said, quote, "Accept the conviction that I do not consider it desirable to obtain a ministerial post. I don't think it's a great man to want to give his name to history just by becoming a minister. As I could see, that was 1,000 times more from the first day. I wanted to become the breakers of the Marxists. I will solve the issue, and if I solve it, then the title of a minister would be a laugh for me. When I stood in front of Richard Wagner's grave for the first time, my heart swelled over Stolz that here rests a man who has asked himself to be written up. Here rests Privy Councillor, Music Director, par excellence, Baron Richard von Wagner, I was proud that this man and so many men of German history made up their way to give their name to posterity, not their title. I didn't want to be a drummer out of modesty. That is the highest, and the other is a small thing." After his stay in Landsberg, Hitler no longer referred to himself as the drummer. Occasionally he would describe himself in the words of St. Matthew, as a voice crying in the wilderness, or as St. John the Baptist, whose duty was to hew a path for him who was to come, and lead the nation to power and glory. More frequently, however, he referred to himself as the Führer, a name chosen by Hess during their imprisonment. As time went on, it became clear that he was thinking of himself as the Messiah, and that it was he who was destined to lead Germany to glory. His references to the Bible became more frequent, and the movement began to take on a religious atmosphere. Comparisons between Christ and himself became more numerous and found their way into his conversation and speeches. For example, he would say, quote, "When I came to Berlin a few weeks ago and looked at the traffic in the Kurfürstendamm, the luxury, the perversion, the iniquity, the wanton display, and the Jewish materialism disgusted me so thoroughly that I was almost beside myself. I nearly imagined myself to be Jesus Christ when he came to his Father's temple and found it taken by the money changers. I can well imagine how he felt when he seized a whip and scourged them out." Unquote. During his speech, according to Hafstangel, he swung his whip around violently as though to drive out the Jews and the forces of darkness, the enemies of Germany and German honor. Dietrich Eckart, who discovered Hitler as a possible leader and who had witnessed this performance, said later, quote, "When a man gets to the point of identifying himself with Jesus Christ, then he is ripe for an insane asylum." Unquote. The identification in all this was not with Jesus Christ, the crucified, but Jesus Christ the furious, lashing the crowds. As a matter of fact, Hitler has very little admiration for Christ the crucified. Although he was brought up a Catholic and received communion, during the war he severed his connection with the Church directly afterwards. This kind of Christ he considers soft and weak and unsuitable as a German Messiah. The latter must be hard and brutal if he is to save Germany and lead it to its destiny. Quote, "My feeling as a Christian points me to my Lord and Savior as a fighter. It points me to the man who once in loneliness, surrounded by only a few followers, recognized these Jews for what they were and summoned men to fight against them, and who, God's truth, was greatest not as a sufferer, but as a fighter. In boundless love as a Christian and as a man, I read through the passage which tells us how the Lord rose at last in his might and seized the scourge to drive out of the temple the brood of vipers and adders. How terrific was the fight for the world against the Jewish poison." And to Rauschning he once referred to the Jewish Christ creed with its effeminate pity ethics. It is not clear from the evidence whether the new state religion was part of Hitler's plan or whether developments were such that it became feasible. It is true that Rosenberg had long advocated such a move, but there is no evidence that Hitler was inclined to take such a drastic step until after he had come to power. It is possible that he felt he needed the power before he could initiate such a change, or it may be that his series of successes were so startling that people spontaneously adopted a religious attitude towards him, which made the move more or less obvious. In any case, he has accepted this godlike role without any hesitation or embarrassment. White tells us that now, when he is addressed with the salutation, "Heil Hitler, our Savior," he bows slightly at the compliment in the phrase and believes it. As time goes on, it becomes more and more certain that Hitler believes that he really is the chosen one, and that in his thinking he conceives of himself as a second Christ who has been sent to institute in the world a new system of values based upon brutality and violence. He has fallen in love with the image of himself in this role and has surrounded himself with his own portraits. His mission seems to lure him to still greater heights. Not content with the role of transitory savior, it pushes him on to higher goals. He must set the pattern for generations to come. Von Wiegen says, quote, "In vital matters, Hitler is far from unmindful of the name and record of success and failure he will leave to posterity," unquote. Nor is he content to allow these patterns to evolve in a natural way. In order to guarantee the future, he feels that he alone can bind it to these principles. He believes, therefore, that he must become an immortal to the German people. Everything must be huge and befitting as a monument to the honor of Hitler. His idea of a permanent building is one which will endure at least 1,000 years. His highways must be known as Hitler highways, and they must endure for longer periods of time than the Napoleonic roads. He must always be doing the impossible and leaving his mark on the country. This is one of the ways in which he hopes to stay alive in the minds of the German people for generations to come. It is alleged by many writers, among them Hafner, Huss, and Wagner, that he has already drawn extensive plans for his own mausoleum. Our informants who left Germany some time ago are not in a position to verify these reports. They consider them well within the realm of possibility, however. This mausoleum is to be the Mecca of Germany after his death. It is to be a tremendous monument about 700 feet high, with all the details worked out so that the greatest psychological effect might be attained. It is also alleged that his first errand in Paris after the conquest in 1940 was a visit to the Dôme des Invalides to study the monument to Napoleon. He found this lacking in many respects. For example, they had put him down in a hole which forced people to look down rather than high up. Quote, "I shall never make such a mistake," Hitler said suddenly. "I know how to keep my hold on people after I've passed on. I shall be the Führer they look up at and go home to talk of and remember. My life shall not end in the mere form of death. It will, on the contrary, begin then." Unquote. It was believed for a time that the Kelstein had been originally built as an eternal mausoleum by Hitler. It seems, however, that if that was his original intention, he has abandoned it in favor of something even more grandiose. Perhaps the Kelstein was too inaccessible to enable large numbers of people to come and touch his tomb in order to become inspired. In any case, it seems far more extravagant plans have been developed. His plan, if it is to be successful, needs constant emotional play on hysteric mass minds, and the more he can arrange the ways and means of achieving this after he dies, the more assured he is of attaining his final goal. Quote, "He is firmly convinced that the furious pace and the epochal age in which he lived and moved, he really is convinced that he is the motivating force and the molder of that age, will terminate soon after his death, swinging the world by nature and inclination into a long span of digestive process marked by a sort of quiet inactivity. People in his 1,000-year Reich will build monuments to him and go around to touch and look at the things he has built," he thought. He said as much on that glorified visit to Rome in 1938, adding that 1,000 years hence the greatness and not the ruins of his own time must intrigue the people of those faraway days. For, believe it or not, this is how the mind of this man Hitler projects itself without a blush over the centuries. Unquote. There was a time a few years ago when he spoke a good deal about retiring when his work was done. It was assumed that he would then take up his residence in Berchtesgaden and sit as God who guides the destinies of the Reich until he dies. In July 1933, while visiting the Wagner family, he talked at length about getting old and complained bitterly that 10 years of valuable time had been lost between the beer hall putsch in 1923 and his ascension to power. This was all very regrettable, since he predicted that it would take 22 years to get things in adequate shape so that he could turn them over to his successor. It is supposed by some writers that during this period of retirement he could also write a book which would stand for eternity, as great as a Bible of National Socialism. This is all rather interesting in view of Rome's statement made many years ago. Quote, "He prefers to sit in the mountains and play the dear God." Unquote. A survey of all the evidence forces us to conclude that Hitler believes himself destined to become an immortal Hitler, chosen by God to be the new deliverer of Germany and the founder of a new social order for the world. He firmly believes this and is certain that in spite of all the trials and tribulations through which he must pass, he will finally attain that goal. The one condition is that he follow the dictates of the inner voice which have guided and protected him in the past. This conviction is not rooted in the truth of the ideas he imparts, but is based on the conviction of his own personal greatness. Howard K. Smith makes an interesting observation. Quote, I was convinced that of all the millions on whom the Hitler myth had fastened itself, the most carried away was Adolf Hitler himself. Unquote. We will have occasion in Part 5 to examine the origins of this conviction and the role it plays in Hitler's psychological economy. Part 2. Hitler as the German people know him. When we try to formulate a conception of Adolf Hitler as the German people know him, we must not forget that their knowledge of him is limited by a controlled press. Many thousands of Germans have seen him in person, particularly in the past, and can use this experience as a basis for their individual conception of him. Hitler, from a physical point of view, is not, however, a very imposing figure, certainly not the Platonic idea of a great fighting leader, or the deliverer of Germany and the creator of a new Reich. In height he is a little below average. His hips are wide and his shoulders relatively narrow. His muscles are flabby, his legs short, thin, and spindly, the latter being hidden in the past by heavy boots and more recently by long trousers. He has a large torso and is hollow-chested to the point where it is said that he has his uniforms padded. From a physical point of view, he could not pass the requirements to his own elite guard. His dress in the early days was no more attractive. He frequently wore the Bavarian mountain costume of leather shorts with white shirt and suspenders. These were not always too clean, and with his mouth full of brown, rotten teeth and his dirty, long fingernails, he presented rather a grotesque figure. At this time he also had a pointed beard, and his dark brown hair was parted in the middle and pasted down flat against his head with oil. Nor was his gait that of a soldier. Quote, it was a very ladylike walk, dainty little steps. Every few steps he cocked his right shoulder nervously, his left leg snapping up as he did so. Unquote. He also had a tic in his face, which caused the corner of his lips to curl upward. When speaking, he always dressed in a common-looking blue suit, which robbed him of all distinctiveness. At the trial following the unsuccessful beer hall putsch, Edgar Maurer, who saw him for the first time, asked himself, quote, was this provincial dandy with his slick dark hair, his cutaway coat, his awkward gestures and glib tongue, the terrible rebel? He seemed for all the world like a traveling salesman for a clothing firm. Unquote. Nor did he make a much better impression later on. Dorothy Thompson, upon her first meeting, described him in the following terms. Unquote. Quote, he is formless, almost faceless, a man whose countenance is a caricature, a man whose framework seems cartilaginous, without bones. He is inconsequent and voluble, ill-poised and insecure. He is the very prototype of the little man. Unquote. Smith also found him the apotheosis of the little man, funny-looking, self-conscious, and unsure of himself. It may be supposed that this is only the judgment of American journalists who have a different standard of masculine beauty. However, while testifying as a witness in the law court of 1923, Professor Max von Gruber of the University of Munich and the most eminent eugenicist in Germany stated, quote, it was the first time I had seen Hitler close at hand. Face and head of inferior type, crossbreed, low receding forehead, ugly nose, broad cheekbones, little eyes, dark hair. Expression not of a man exercising authority in perfect self-command, but of a raving excitement. At the end, an expression of satisfied egotism. Unquote. A great deal has been written about his eyes, which have been described in terms of almost every color of the rainbow. As a matter of fact, they seem to be a rather bright blue, bordering on the violet. But it is not the color which has attracted people, but rather their depth and a glint, which makes them appear to have a hypnotic quality. One finds stories like the following recurring over and over in the literature. A policeman who is noted for his antipathy to the Nazi movement is sent to a Hitler meeting to maintain order. While standing at his post, Hitler enters. Quote, he gazed into the police officer's eye with that fatal, hypnotizing, and irresistible glare which swept the poor officer right off his feet. Clicking to attention, he confessed to me this morning, since last night I am a National Socialist. Heil Hitler. Unquote. These stories are not all from the Nazi propaganda agencies. Very reliable people now in this country have reported similar incidents among their own personal acquaintances. Even outstanding diplomats have commented on the nature of his eyes and the way in which he uses them when meeting people, often with disastrous effects. Then there are others like Rauschning, who finds his look staring and dead, lacking in brilliance and the sparkle of genuine animation. We need not dwell on his eyes and their peculiar quality, however, since relatively few Germans have come in such close contact with him that they could be seriously affected by them. Whatever effect Hitler's personal appearance may have had on the German people in the past, it is safe to assume that this has been greatly tempered by millions of posters pasted in every conceivable place, which show the Fuhrer as a fairly good-looking individual with a very determined attitude. In addition, the press, newsreels, etc. are continually flooded with carefully prepared photographs showing Hitler at his very best. These have undoubtedly in the course of time blotted out any unfavorable impressions he may have created as a real person in the past. The physical Hitler most Germans know now is a fairly presentable individual. The only other real contact the overwhelming majority of people have had with Hitler is through his voice. He was a tireless speaker, and before he came to power, he would sometimes give as many as 3 or 4 speeches on the same day, often in different cities. Even his greatest opponents concede that he is the greatest orator that Germany has ever known. This is a great concession in view of the fact that the qualities of his voice are far from pleasant. Many, in fact, find it distinctly unpleasant. It has a rasping quality which often breaks into a shrill falsetto when he becomes aroused. Nor is it his diction which makes him a great orator. In the early days this was particularly bad. It was a conglomeration of High German with an Austrian dialect which Chupik describes as Nudelige Sprache. Nor was it the structure of his speeches which made him a great orator. On the whole, his speeches were sinfully long, badly constructed, and very repetitious. Some of them are positively painful to read, but nevertheless, when he delivered them, they had an extraordinary effect upon his audiences. His power and fascination in speaking lay almost wholly in his ability to sense what a given audience wanted to hear, then to manipulate his theme in such a way that he would arouse the emotions of the crowd. Strasser says of this talent, quote, Hitler responds to the vibration of the human heart with the delicacy of a seismograph, enabling him, with certainty with which no conscious gift could endow him, to act as a loudspeaker, proclaiming the most secret desires, the least permissible instincts, the sufferings and personal revolts of a whole nation, unquote. Before coming to power, almost all of his speeches centered around the following 3 themes. 1. The treason of November criminals. 2. The rule of the Marxists must be broken. And 3. The world domination of the Jews. No matter what topic was advertised for a given speech, he almost invariably would wind up on one or more of these 3 themes. And yet people liked it and would attend one meeting after another to hear him speak. It was not, therefore, so much what he said that appealed to his audiences as how he said it. Even in the early days, Hitler was a showman with a great sense of the dramatic. Not only did he schedule his speeches late in the evening when his audience would be tired and their resistance lowered through natural causes, but he would always send an assistant ahead of time to make a short speech and warm the audience up. Stormtroopers always played an important role at these meetings and would line the aisle through which he would pass. At the psychological moment, Hitler would appear in the door at the back of the hall. Then with a small group behind him, he would march through the rows of SA men to reach the speaker's table. He never glanced to the right or to the left as he came down the aisle, and became greatly annoyed if anyone tried to accost him or hampered his progress. Whenever possible, he would have a band present, and they would strike up a lively military march as he came down the aisle. When he began to speak, he usually manifested signs of nervousness. Usually he was unable to say anything of consequence until he had gotten the feel of his audience. On one occasion, Haydn reports, he was so nervous that he could think of nothing to say. In order to do something, he picked up the table and moved it around on the platform. Then suddenly he got the feel and was able to go on. Price describes his speaking in the following way. Quote, the beginning is slow and halting. Gradually he warms up when the spiritual atmosphere of the great crowd is engendered, for he responds to this metaphysical contact in such a way that each member of the multitude feels bound to him by an individual link of sympathy, unquote. All of our informants report the slow start, waiting for the feel of the audience. As soon as he has found it, the tempo increases in smooth rhythm and volume until he is shouting at the climax. Through all this, the listener seems to identify himself with Hitler's voice, which becomes the voice of Germany. This is all in keeping with Hitler's own conception of mass psychology, as given in Mein Kampf, where he says, quote, the psyche of the broad masses does not respond to anything weak or halfway, like a woman whose spiritual sensitiveness is determined less by abstract reason than by an indefinable emotional longing for fulfilling power, and who, for that reason, prefers to submit to the strong rather than the weakling. The mass, too, prefers the ruler to a pleader. And Hitler let them have it. Newsweek reported, quote, women faint when, with face purpled and contorted with effort, he blows forth his magic oratory, unquote. Flanner says, quote, his oratory used to wilt his collar, unglue his forelock, glaze his eyes. He was like a man hypnotized, repeating himself into a frenzy, unquote. Yates Brown, quote, he was a man transformed and possessed. We were in the presence of a miracle, unquote. This fiery oratory was something new to the Germans, and in particularly to the slow-tongued lower-class Bavarians. In Munich, his shouting and gesturing were a spectacle men paid to see. It was not only his fiery oratory, however, that won the crowds to his cause. This was certainly something new, but far more important was the seriousness with which his words were spoken." Unquote. Every one of his words comes out charged with a powerful current of energy. At times it seems as if they are torn from the very heart of the man, causing him an indescribable anguish. Leaning from the tribune, as if he were trying to impel his inner self into the consciousness of all these thousands, he was holding the masses and me with them under a hypnotic spell. It was clear that Hitler was feeling the exaltation of the emotional response now surging up toward him. His voice rising to passionate climaxes, his words were like a scourge. When he stopped speaking, his chest was still heaving with emotion." Unquote. Many writers have commented upon his ability to hypnotize his audience. Stanley High reports, quote, "When at the climax he sways from one side to the other, has his listeners sway with him. When he leads forward, they also lean forward, and when he concludes, they are either awed and silent or on their feet in a frenzy." Unquote. Unquestionably, as a speaker, he has had a powerful influence on the common run of German people. His meetings were always crowded, and by the time he got through speaking, he had completely numbed the critical faculties of his listeners to the point where they were willing to believe almost anything he said. He flattered them and cajoled them. He hurled accusations at them one moment and amused them the next by building up a straw man, which he promptly knocked down. His tongue was like a lash which whipped up the emotions of his audience. And somehow he always managed to say what the majority of the audience was already secretly thinking but could not verbalize. When the audience began to respond, it affected him in return. Before long, to this reciprocal relationship, he and his audience became intoxicated with the emotional appeal of his oratory. It was this Hitler that the German people knew at first hand. Hitler, the fiery orator, who tirelessly rushed from one meaning to another, working himself to the point of exhaustion on their behalf. Hitler, whose heart and soul were in the cause, and who struggled endlessly against overwhelming odds and obstacles to open their eyes to the true state of affairs. Hitler, who could arouse their emotions and channelize them towards goals of national aggrandizement. Hitler, the courageous, who dared to speak the truth and defy national authorities as well as the international oppressors. It was a sincere Hitler that they knew, whose words burned into the most secret recesses of their minds and rebuked them for their own shortcomings. It was the Hitler who would lead them back to self-respect because he had faith in them. This fundamental conception of Hitler made a beautiful foundation for a propaganda buildup. He was so convincing on the speaker's platform and appeared to be so sincere in what he said that the majority of his listeners were ready to believe almost anything good about him because they wanted to believe it. The Nazi propaganda agencies were not slow in making the most of their opportunities. Hitler himself had provided an excellent background for a propaganda buildup. From the earliest days of his political career, he had steadfastly refused to divulge anything about his personal life, past or present. To his most immediate associates, he was, in reality, a man of mystery. There was no clearing away the unpleasant incidents to be done before the building-up process could begin. In fact, the more secrecy he maintained about his personal life, the more curious his followers became. This was, indeed, fertile ground on which to build a myth or legend. The Nazi propaganda machine devoted all of its efforts to the task of portraying Hitler as something extra-human. Everything he did was written up in such a way that it portrayed his superlative character. If he does not eat meat, drink alcoholic beverages, or smoke, it is not due to the fact that he has some kind of inhibition, or does it because he believes it will improve his health. Such things are not worthy of the Fuhrer. He abstains from these because he is following the example of the great German, Richard Wagner, or because he has discovered that it increases his energy and endurance to such a degree that he can give much more of himself to the creation of the new German Reich. Such abstinence also indicates, according to the propaganda, that the Fuhrer is a person with tremendous willpower and self-discipline. Hitler himself fosters this conception, according to Hafstangl, for when someone asked him how he managed to give up these things, he replied, "It is a matter of will. Once I make up my mind not to do a thing, I just don't do it. And once that decision is made, it is taken for always." Isn't that so wonderful? The same is true in the field of sex. As far as the German people know, he has no sex life, and this too is clothed not as an abnormality, but as a great virtue. The Fuhrer is above human weaknesses of this sort, and von Wiegen tells us that he has a profound contempt for the weaknesses in men, for sex and the fools that it makes of them. Hafstangl reports that Hitler frequently makes the statement that he will never marry a woman since Germany is his only bride. However, Hitler, with his deep insight into human nature, appreciates these weaknesses in others and is tolerant of them. He does not even condemn them or forbid them among his closest associates. He is also portrayed in the propaganda as the soul of kindliness and generosity. Endless stories that illustrate these virtues are found over and over again in the literature. Price cites a typical example. An attractive young peasant girl tries to approach him, but is prevented from doing so by the guards. She bursts into tears, and Hitler, seeing her distress, inquires into the cause. She tells him that her fiancé had been expelled from Austria for his Nazi principles, and that he cannot find work, and consequently they cannot get married. Hitler is deeply touched. He promises to find the young man a job, and in addition completely furnishes a flat for them to live in, even down to a baby's cot. Every attempt is made to present him as extremely human, with a deep feeling for the problems of ordinary people. Many great writers, both Nazi and anti-Nazi, have written extensively about his great love for children, and the Nazi press is certainly full of pictures showing Hitler in the company of little tots. It is alleged that when he is at Berchtesgaden, he always has the children from the neighborhood visit him in the afternoon, and that he serves them candy, ice cream, cake. Fayer says, "Never was there a middle-aged bachelor who so delighted in the company of children." Princess Olga reported that when she visited Hitler in Berlin and the topic of children came up during the conversation, Hitler's eyes filled with tears. The Nazi press had made extremely good use of this, and endless stories accompany the pictures. Likewise, a great deal is written about his fondness for animals, particularly dogs. Here again, there are numberless pictures to prove it is so. As far as dogs are concerned, the propaganda build-up is Hitler's modesty and simplicity. His successes point to other respects. One writer even went so far as to attribute his vegetarianism to his inability to tolerate the thought of animals being slaughtered for human consumption. Hitler is pictured as an affable lord of the manor, full of gentleness, kindliness, and helpfulness. Or, as Oxner puts it, he is the great comforter, father, husband, brother, or son, to every German who lacks or has lost such a relative. Another trait which has received a great deal of comment in the propaganda is probably fairly nearer the truth, but it goes far beyond that, have never gone to his head. At bottom he is still the simple soul he was when he founded the party, and his greatest joy is to be considered as one of the boys. As proof of this, they point to the fact that he has never sought a crown, that he never appears in gaudy uniforms or does a great deal of entertaining. Even after he came to power, he continued to wear his old trench coat and slouch hat for a time, and when he donned a uniform, it was always that of a simple stormtrooper. Much was written about his fondness for visits from early acquaintances, and how he loved to sit down in the midst of his busy day in order to talk over old times. There was really nothing he liked better than to frequent his old haunts and meet old friends while he was in Munich, or to take part in their festivities. At heart he was still a worker, and his interests were always with the working classes, with whom he felt thoroughly at home. Hitler is also a man of incredible energy and endurance. His day consists of 16 to 18 hours of uninterrupted work. He is absolutely tireless when it comes to working for Germany and its future welfare, and no personal pleasures are permitted to interfere with the carrying out of his mission. The ordinary man in the street cannot imagine a human being in Hitler's position not taking advantage of his opportunity. He can only imagine himself in the same position, reveling in luxuries, and yet here is Hitler who scorns them all. His only conclusion is that Hitler is not an ordinary mortal. Phillips reports the case of a young Nazi who once confided to him, quote, "I would die for Hitler, but I would not change places with Hitler. At least when I wake every morning I can say, 'Hi, Hitler.' But this man, he has no fun in life. No smoking, no drinking, no women. Only work until he falls asleep at night," unquote. A great deal is made of Hitler's determination. It is pointed out over and over again that he never gives up once he has made up his mind to attain a particular goal. No matter how rough the road he plods along in unswerving determination. Even though he receives serious setbacks and the situation appears to be hopeless, he never loses faith and always gets what he goes after. He refuses to be coerced into compromises of any sort, and is always ready to assume the full responsibility for his actions. The great trials and tribulations through which the party had to pass on its way to power are cited over and over again, and all the credit is given to Hitler and his fanatical faith in the future. Even his refusal to permit ordinary scruples to get in his way is given as a sign of his greatness. The fact that he did not communicate with his family for over 10 years becomes a great virtue, since it meant a severe deprivation to the young man who was determined to make something of himself before he returned home. A great deal of publicity has also been given to his breadth of vision, ability to penetrate the future, and his ability to organize both the party and the country in preparation for obstacles they will have to overcome. According to the propagandist, Hitler is the soul of efficiency and has an extraordinary power of resolving conflicts and simplifying problems which have stumped all experts in the past. In fact, his infallibility and incorruptibility throughout are not only implied but openly stated in no uncertain terms. He is also a person of great patience who would never spill a drop of human blood if it could possibly be avoided. Over and over again one hears of his great patience with the democracies, with Czechoslovakia and with Poland. But here, as in his private life, he never loses control of his emotions. Fundamentally, he is a man of peace who desires nothing quite so much as to be left alone to work out the destiny of Germany in a quiet and constructive manner. For he is a builder at heart and an artist, and these prove that the creative and constructive elements in his nature are predominant. This does not mean, however, that he is a coward. On the contrary, he is a person of outstanding courage. His way of life is proof of this, as well as his enviable record during the last war. A great many stories about his decorations for bravery have been circulated, in particularly for his outstanding heroism when he was awarded the Iron Cross First Class. The fact that the stories of his performance vary from one time to another does not seem to disturb the people in the least. Fundamentally, according to the Nazi press, Hitler is a man of steel. He is well aware of his mission, and no amount of persuasion, coercion, sacrifices, or unpleasant duties can persuade him to alter his course. In the face of all sorts of disasters and disagreeable happenings and necessary measures, he never loses his nerve for a moment. But he is not hard in human qualities. He places loyalty and justice as the two greatest virtues and observes them with scrupulous care. Loyalty means so much to him that the inscription over his door at Berchtesgaden reads, "Meine Ehre heißt true." He is the acme of German honor and purity, the resurrector of the German family and home. He is the greatest architect of all time, the greatest military genius in all history. He has an inexhaustible fount of knowledge. He is a man of action and the creator of new social values. He is indeed, according to the Nazi Propaganda Bureau, the paragon of all virtues. A few typical examples may illustrate the extent to which they are carried in their praise of him. Quote, "Hitler is a modest man, and the world needs modest men. Therefore the people love him. Like every good leader, he must be an efficient follower. He makes himself the humblest disciple of himself, the severest of all disciplinarians with himself. In fact, Hitler is a modern monk, with the 3 knots of poverty, chastity, and obedience tied in his invisible girdle. A zealot among zealots. He eats no meat, drinks no wine, does not smoke. I am told he takes for himself no salary, but lives privately from the income of his book Mein Kampf. Surplus funds he turns back to the SA. His workday consists of 18 hours usually, and he often falls asleep in the last hour of his work. There have been 4 women in his life, but only to help him along with service and money. He once gave a lecture at Bayreuth on Wagner and Deutsche Lieder that astounded the musical critics and revealed him as a musical scholar of parts. Sheer opportunism never lured him, as much as the opportunity to preach his doctrines. His quality is messianic, his spiritual trend is ascetic, his reaction is medieval. Phillips, Germany Today and Tomorrow. Hitler not only knows about all these writings, but since he has always been the guiding spirit in all German propaganda and usually plans the broad lines that are to be followed, it is safe to assume that he himself is responsible for the instigation and development of this mythical personality. When we look back over the development of this build-up, we can see clearly that Hitler, from the very beginning, planned on making himself a mythological figure. He opens Mein Kampf with the following passage, quote, "In this little town on the River Inn, Bavarian by blood and Austrian by nationality, gilded by the light of German martyrdom, there lived at the end of the 80s of the last century my parents, the father a faithful civil servant, the mother devoting herself to the cares of the household and looking after her children with the eternally the same loving kindness." This is the classic way of beginning a fairy tale rather than a serious autobiography or a political treatise. In the very first sentence of the book, he implies that fate was already smiling on him at the time of his birth, for it reads, quote, "Today I consider it in my good fortune that fate designated Braunau on the Inn as the place of my birth." Unquote. As soon as Hitler came to power, new weapons for self-aggrandizement were put into the hands of the propagandists, and they made good use of them. Unemployment dropped off rapidly. Roads that the Germans never dreamed of sprung up overnight. New and imposing buildings were erected with astounding rapidity. The face of Germany was being lifted at an incredible speed. Hitler was keeping his promises. He was accomplishing the impossible. Every success in diplomacy, every social reform was heralded as world-shaking in its importance. And for each success, Hitler modestly accepted all the credit. It was always Hitler that did this, and Hitler who did that, provided that these acts were spectacular and met with the approval of the public. If they happened to meet with disapproval, it was always one of his assistants who was to blame. Every effort was made to cultivate the attitude that Hitler was infallible and was carrying through his mission of saving Germany. It was not long before the German people were prepared to take the short step of seeing Hitler not as a man, but as a messiah of Germany. Public meetings, and particularly the Nuremberg, took on a religious atmosphere. All the stagings were designated to create a supernatural and religious atmosphere, and Hitler's entry was more befitting a god than a man. In Berlin, one of the large art shops on Unter den Linden exhibited a large portrait of Hitler in the center of its display window. Hitler's portrait was entirely surrounded as though by a halo, with various copies of a painting of Christ. Notes appeared on the press to the effect that als sprach, horte man den Mantel Gottes durch den Saal rauschen. Weimar reports that on one side of a hill in Odenwald, conspicuous as a waterfall, painted on white canvas, were the black words, "We believe in Holy Germany is Hitler, we believe in Holy Hitler." Roberts reports, in Munich in the early autumn of 1936, I saw colored pictures of Hitler in the actual silver garments of the Knights of the Grail, but these were soon withdrawn. They gave the show away. They were too near the truth of Hitler's mentality. Teeling writes that at the Nuremberg Nazi Party rally in September 1937, there was a huge photograph of Hitler underneath which was the inscription, quote, "In the beginning was the Word," unquote. He also says that the mayor of Hamburg assured him, quote, "We need no priests or parsons. We communicate direct with God through Adolf Hitler. He has many Christ-like qualities," unquote. Soon these sentiments were introduced by official circles. Rauschning reports that the party has adopted this creed. Quote, "We believe in Adolf Hitler, our leader on this earth, and we confess that National Socialism is the only faith that makes us happy." A Rhenish group of German Christians in April 1937 passed this resolution, quote, "Hitler's word is God's law. The decrees and laws which represent it possess divine authority," unquote. And Reich's Minister for Church Affairs, Hans Karel, says, quote, "There has arisen a new authority as to what Christ and Christianity really are. That is Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler is the true Holy Ghost," unquote. This is the way Hitler hopes to pave his path to immortality. It has been carefully planned and consistently executed in a step-by-step fashion. The Hitler the German people know is fundamentally the fiery orator who fascinated them and who has gradually been embroidered by the propaganda until he is now presented to them as a full-fledged deity. Everything else is carefully concealed from them as a whole. How many Germans believe it, we do not know. Some certainly believe it wholeheartedly. Dorothy Thompson writes of such a case, quote, "At Garmisch I met an American from Chicago. He had been at Oberammergau at the Passion Play. 'These people are all crazy,' he said. 'This is not a revolution, it's a revival. They think Hitler is God. Believe it or not, a German woman sat next to me at the Passion Play, and when they hosted Jesus on the cross, she said, 'There he is, that is our Führer, our Hitler.' And when they paid out the 30 pieces of silver to Judas, she said, 'That is Rome who betrayed the leader,' unquote." Extreme cases of this kind are probably not very numerous, but it would be amazing if a small degree of the same type of thinking had not seeped into the picture of Hitler, which many Germans hold. Part 3. Hitler as his associates know him. The picture the Nazi propaganda machine has painted of Hitler certainly seems like an extravagant one. Even if we ignore the deifying elements, it seems like a fantasy of a Superman, the paragon of all virtues. Extraordinary as it may seem, however, there are times at which he approximates such a personality and wins the respect and admiration of all of his associates. At such times he is a veritable demon for work and often works for several days on end with little or no sleep. His powers of concentration are extraordinary, and he is able to penetrate very complex problems and reduce them to a simple few fundamental factors. He prides himself on this talent and has said to various people, quote, "I have the gift of reducing all problems to their simplest foundations, a gift for tracing back all theories to their roots in reality." And he really has it. Unencumbered with abstract theories or traditional points of view and prejudices, he is able to look at complex problems in a rather naive way and pick out the most salient and significant elements and apply them to the present situation in a fairly simple and workable manner. To be sure, he never solves the entire problem in this way, but only the human elements involved. Since this is the part which interests him most and produces immediate results, it has been rated very highly and has won the admiration of his close associates from the earliest days of his political career. During these periods of activity, Hitler is completely absorbed in the task confronting him. Conference follows conference with great rapidity. His judgments are quick and decisive. He is impatient to get things done and expects everyone to apply himself with an ardor equal to his own. He therefore demands great sacrifices from his associates. At such times, however, he is also very human. He shows an unusual degree of considerateness towards others and a certain tolerance of their weaknesses. When he calls a halt for meals, he will not eat until his entire staff has been served. When an overzealous servant insists on serving him before others, he will often get up and take the plate over to one of his lowly assistants. During all of this, he is in the best of spirits and jokes with everyone around him. He has an extraordinary memory and continuously recalls amusing incidents from the past lives of those around him. These he tells to his staff at large. He is an excellent mimic and often plays out the role of the individual involved to the great amusement of the staff, while the individual must sit by and witness the performance, much to his own embarrassment. Nevertheless, he is thoroughly flattered that the Führer should single him out and remember him and his actions in such detail. During these periods, Hitler is also the soul of kindliness and generosity. He acts more like a big brother to his staff than as a Führer, and manages to endear himself to each and every one of them. But underneath, he is still every inch the Führer. He displays extraordinary courage and determination. He shows a great deal of initiative and is willing to assume full responsibility for the wisdom of the course he has mapped out. He is very persuasive and is able to muster and organize his people into an efficient, smooth-running unit. Personal frictions disappear for the time being, and everybody has but a single thought in mind: to do what the Führer wishes. He works with great certainty and security and appears to have the situation entirely in hand. All kinds of facts and figures relevant to the problem flow from him without the slightest hesitation or effort, much to the amazement of those about him. He can cite the tonnages of ships in various navies. Quote, he knows exactly what kind of armament, the kind of armor plates, the weight, the speed, and the number of the crew of every ship in the British Navy. He knows the number of rotations of airplane motors in every model and type existent. He knows the number of shots a machine gun fires a minute, whether it is a light, medium, or heavy one, whether it was made in the United States, Czechoslovakia, or France. Unquote. Then, too, his staff has learned from past experience that when Hitler is one of these moods, he approximates infallibility, particularly with the support of the people, is needed to carry through the project on which he is engaged. This may seem like an unwarranted statement, but if our study is to be complete, we must appraise his strengths as well as his weaknesses. It can scarcely be denied that he has some extraordinary abilities where the psychology of the average man is concerned. He has been able, in some manner or other, to unearth and apply successfully many factors pertaining to group psychology, the importance of which has not been generally recognized, and some of which we might adopt to good advantage. These might be briefly summarized as follows. 1. Full appreciation of the importance of the masses in the success of any movement. Hitler has phrased this very well in Mein Kampf. Quote, the lack of knowledge of the internal driving forces of great changes led to an insufficient evaluation of the importance of the great masses of the people. From this resulted the scanty interest in the social question, the deficient courting of the soul of the nation's lower classes. Unquote. 2. Recognition of the inestimable value of winning the support of youth. Realization of the immense momentum given a social movement by the wild fervor and enthusiasm of young people, as well as the importance of early training and indoctrination. 3. Recognition of the role of women in advancing a new movement, and of the fact that the reactions of the masses as a whole have many feminine characteristics. As early as 1923, he said to Hafstangl, quote, do you know the audience at a circus is just like a woman? Die Masse, das Volk ist wie ein Weib. Someone who does not understand the intrinsically feminine character of the masses will never be an effective speaker. Ask yourself, what does a woman expect from a man? Clearness, decision, power, and action. What we want is to get the masses to act. Like a woman, the masses fluctuate between extremes. The crowd is not only like a woman, but women can constitute the most important element in an audience. The women usually lead, then follow the children, and at last, when I have already won over the whole family, follow the fathers. Unquote. And in Mein Kampf he writes, quote, the people in an overwhelming majority are so feminine in their nature and attitude that their activities and thoughts are motivated less by sober consideration than by feeling and sentiment. Unquote. 4. The ability to feel, identify, and express in passionate language the deepest needs and sentiments of the average German and to present opportunities or possibilities for their gratification. 5. Capacity to appeal to the most primitive as well as the most ideal inclinations in man, to arouse the basest instincts and yet cloak them with nobility, justifying all actions as means to the attainment of an ideal goal. Hitler realized that men will not combine and dedicate themselves to a common purpose unless this purpose be an ideal one capable of survival beyond their generation. He has also perceived that although men will die only for an ideal, their continued zest and enterprise can be maintained only by a succession of more immediate and earthly satisfactions. 6. Appreciation of the fact that the masses are as hungry for a sustaining ideology and political action as they are for daily bread. Any movement which does not satisfy this spiritual hunger in the masses will not mobilize their wholehearted support and is destined to fail. Quote, all force which does not spring from a firm spiritual foundation will be hesitating and uncertain. It lacks the stability which can only rest on a fanatical view of life. Every attempt at fighting a view of life by means of force will finally fail unless the fight against it represents the form of an attack for the sake of a new spiritual direction. Only in the struggle of two views of life with each other can the weapon of brute force, used continuously and ruthlessly, bring about the decision in favor of the side it supports. Unquote. 7. The ability to portray conflicting human forces in vivid, concrete imagery that is understandable and moving to the ordinary man. This comes down to the use of metaphors in the form of imagery, which, as Aristotle has said, is the most powerful force on earth. 8. The faculty of drawing on the traditions of the people and by reference to the great classical mythological themes evoke the deepest unconscious emotions of the audience. The fact that the unconscious mind is more intensely affected by the great eternal symbols and themes is not generally understood by most modern speakers and writers. 9. Realization that enthusiastic political action does not take place if the emotions are not deeply involved. 10. Appreciation of the willingness, almost desire, of the masses to sacrifice themselves on the altar of social improvement or spiritual values. 11. Realization of the importance of artistry and dramatic intensity in conducting large meetings, rallies, and festivals. This involves not only an appreciation of what the artist, the writer, musician, and painter can accomplish in the way of evoking emotional responses, but also the leader's recognition of the necessity of his participation in the total dramatic effect as chief character and hero. Hitler has become master of all the arts of highlighting his own role in the movement for a greater Germany. Schirrer describes this very well. Quote, a searchlight plays upon his lone figure as he walks slowly through the hall, never looking to the right or left, his right hand raised in salute, his left hand at the buckle of his belt. He never smiles. It is a religious rite, this procession of the modern Messiah incarnate. Behind him are his adjutants and Secret Service men, but his figure alone is flooded with light. By the time Hitler has reached the rostrum, the masses will have been so worked upon that they are ready to do his will. Unquote. 12. A keen appreciation of the value of slogans, catchwords, dramatic phrases, and happy epigrams in penetrating the deeper levels of the psyche. In speaking to Hafstangl on this point, he once used the following figure of speech. Quote, there is only so much room in a brain, so much wall space, as it were, and if you furnish it with your slogans, the opposition has no place to put up any pictures later on, because the apartment of the brain is already crowded with your furniture. Hafstangl adds that Hitler has always admired the use of the Catholic Church made of slogans and has tried to imitate it. Unquote. 13. Realization of a fundamental loneliness and feeling of isolation in people living under modern conditions, and a craving to belong to an active group which carries a certain status, provides cohesiveness, and gives the individual a feeling of personal worth and belongingness. 14. Appreciation of the value underlying a hierarchical political organization which affords direct contact with each individual. 15. Ability to surround himself with and maintain the allegiance of a group of devoted aides whose talents complement his own. 16. Appreciation of winning confidence from the people by a show of efficiency within the organization and government. It is said that foods and supplies are already in the local warehouses when the announcement concerning the date of distribution is made. Although they could be distributed immediately, the date is set for several weeks ahead in order to create an impression of super efficiency and win the confidence of the people. Every effort is made to avoid making a promise which cannot be fulfilled at precisely the appointed time. 17. Appreciation of the important role played by little things which affect the everyday life of the ordinary man in building up and maintaining the morale of the people. 18. Full recognition of the fact that the overwhelming majority of the people want to be led and are ready and willing to submit if the leader can win their respect and confidence. Hitler has been very successful in this respect because he has been able to convince his followers of his own self-confidence, and because he has guessed right on so many occasions that he has created the impression of infallibility. 19. This was largely possible because he is naturally a tactical genius. His timing of decisions and actions has almost been uncanny. As Thiessen puts it, quote, sometimes his intelligence is astonishing, miraculous political intuition, devoid of all moral sense, but extraordinarily precise. Even in a very complex situation, he discerns what is possible and what is not, unquote. 20. Hitler's strongest point is perhaps his firm belief in his mission, and in public the complete dedication of his life to its fulfillment. It is the spectacle of a man whose convictions are so strong that he sacrifices himself for the cause which appeals to others and induces them to follow his example. This demands a fanatical stubbornness which Hitler possesses to a high degree. Quote, only a storm of glowing passion can turn the destinies of nations, but this passion can only be roused by a man who carries it within himself, unquote. 21. He also has the ability to appeal to and arouse the sympathetic concern and protectiveness of his people, to represent himself as the bearer of their burdens and their future, with the result that he becomes a personal concern to individuals, and many, particularly the women, feel tenderly and compassionately about him. They must always be careful not to inflict undue annoyance or suffering on the Führer. 22. Hitler's ability to repudiate his own conscience in arriving at political decisions has eliminated the force which usually checks and complicates the forward-going thoughts and resolutions of most socially responsible statesmen. He has, therefore, been able to take that course of action which appeals to him as most effective without pulling his punches. The result has been that he has frequently outwitted his adversaries and attained ends which would not have been easily attained by a normal course. Nevertheless, it has helped to build the myth of his infallibility and invincibility. 23. Equally important has been his ability to persuade others to repudiate their individual consciences and assume that role himself. He can then decree for the individual what is right and wrong, permissible and unpermissible, and can use them freely in the attainment of his own ends. As Goering had said, quote, I have no conscience. My conscience is Adolf Hitler, unquote. 24. This has enabled Hitler to make full use of terror and mobilize the fears of the people, which he evaluated with an almost uncanny precision. 25. He has a capacity for learning from others even though he may be violently opposed to everything they believe and stand for. The use of terror, for example, he says he learned from the communists, the use of slogans from the Catholic Church, the use of propaganda from the democracies, etc. 26. He is a master of the art of propaganda. Lüdecke writes, quote, he has a matchless instinct for taking advantage of every breeze to raise a political whirlwind. No official scandal was so petty that he could not magnify it into high treason. He could ferret out the most deviously ramified corruption in high places and plaster the town with the bad news, unquote. His primary rules were, never allow the public to cool off, never admit a fault or wrong, never concede that there may be some good in your enemy, never leave room for alternatives, never accept blame. Concentrate on one enemy at a time and blame him for everything that goes wrong. People will believe a big lie sooner than the little one, and if you repeat it frequently enough, people will sooner or later believe it. 27. He has the never say die spirit. After some of his severe setbacks, he has been able to get to his immediate associates together and begin making plans for a comeback. Events which would crush most individuals, at least temporarily, seem to act as stimulants to greater efforts in Hitler. These are some of Hitler's outstanding talents and capacities. They have enabled him to attain a position of unprecedented power in an incredibly short period of time, over a rarely used route. No other Nazi in a high position possesses these abilities in any comparable degree, and consequently they could not displace him in the minds of the masses. His associates recognize these capacities in Hitler, and they admire and respect his extraordinary leadership qualities, particularly the influence he has over people. In addition, they love him for his very human qualities when he is at his best and is engaged in some important undertaking. These are aspects of Hitler's personality we should never lose sight of when evaluating his hold on his associates or on the German people. He has a magnetic quality about him which, together with his past accomplishments, wins the allegiance of people and seems to rob them of their critical functions. It is a bond which does not easily dissolve even in the face of evidence that he is not always what he pretends to be. In fact, he is more often than not the exact opposite. We have reviewed Hitler's strength and briefly portrayed his character when he is at his best. It is now time to look at the other side of his personality, the side which is known only to those who are on fairly intimate terms with him. Perhaps the truest words that Goebbels ever wrote are, quote, the Führer does not change. He is the same now when he was a boy, unquote. If we glance at his boyhood, we find that Hitler was far from a model student. He studied what he wanted to study and did fairly well in these subjects. Things which did not interest him he simply ignored, even though his marks were unsatisfactory or failing. For over a year before his mother died, he did nothing, as far as can be determined, except lie around the house or occasionally paint a few watercolors. Although they were in difficult financial circumstances, he did not seek work or try to improve himself in school. He was self-willed, shy, and inactive. In Vienna, after his mother died, he continued this pattern even though he was frequently on the verge of starvation and reduced to begging on the streets. Hanisch, who was his flophouse buddy, reports that he was never an ardent worker, was unable to get up in the morning, and had difficulty in getting started, and seemed to be suffering from a paralysis of the will. As soon as he had sold a picture and had a little money in his pocket, he stopped work and spent his time listening to Parliament, reading newspapers in the cafes, or delivering lengthy political dissertations to his fellows in the hostel. This behavior he justified on the grounds that, quote, he must have leisure, he was not a coolie, unquote. When Hanisch asked him one day what he was waiting for, Hitler replied, I don't know myself. As an adult, he is still this little boy, except when he is in one of his active moods. In 1931, Billing wrote, quote, the internal difficulties of a Hitler government will lie in the person of Hitler himself. Hitler will not be able to avoid a regulated spiritual activity. Ludica also wrote, he had a typical Austrian Schlamperei, which is layabout. He suffered from all-embracing disorderliness. Naturally, this grew less in time, but at the beginning it was apparent in everything. It was indeed so apparent that early in the history of the movement, the party engaged a secretary whose duty it was to keep track of Hitler and see to it that he fulfilled his duties and obligations. The move was only partially successful, however. Quote, Hitler was always on the go, but rarely on time, unquote. He is still rarely on time and frequently keeps important foreign diplomats as well as his own staff waiting for considerable periods of time. He is unable to maintain any kind of a working schedule. His hours are most irregular, and he may go to bed any time between midnight and 7 o'clock in the morning and get up anywhere from 9 o'clock in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. In later years, the hours tended to get later, but it was unusual for him, just before the war, to go to bed before daybreak. The night, however, was not spent in working, as his propaganda agents allege, but in viewing one or two feature movies, endless newsreels, listening to music, entertaining film stars, or just sitting around chatting with his staff. He seemed to have a violent dislike for going to bed or being alone. Frequently, he would ring for his adjutants in the middle of the night, after his guest had gone home, and demand they sit up and talk to him. It was not that he had anything to say, and often the adjutants would fall asleep listening to him talk about nothing of importance. As long as one of them remained awake, however, he would not be offended. There was an unwritten law among his immediate staff never to ask a question at those early morning sessions, because to do so might get Hitler off on another subject and force them to remain for another hour. Hitler sleeps very badly and has been in the habit for years of taking a sleeping powder every night before retiring. It is possible that he demands someone to be with him in the hope that the powder will take effect and he will be overcome with sleep. His behavior, however, is not in keeping with this hypothesis, for he carries on a monologue and frequently gets very much stirred up about the topic. This is hardly conducive to sleep, and we must suppose that there is some other reason for his late hours. Even after he has dismissed his adjutants and goes to bed, he usually takes an armful of illustrated periodicals with him. These are usually magazines with pictures concerning naval and military matters, and American magazines are usually included. Schreiber reports that he has been informed that since the war broke out, Hitler has been keeping better hours and regularly has his first breakfast at 7 a.m. and his second breakfast at 9 a.m. This may have been so during the early days of the war, but it is very doubtful that Hitler could keep up this schedule for any length of time. Rauschening claims that Hitler has a bed compulsion, which demands that the bed be made in a particular way, with the quilt folded according to a prescribed pattern, and that a man must make the bed before he can go to sleep. We have no other information on this subject, but from his general psychological structure, such a compulsion would be possible. His working day before the war was equally disorderly. Rauschening reports, he does not know how to work steadily. Indeed, he is incapable of working. He dislikes desk work and seldom glances at the piles of reports which are placed on his desk daily. No matter how important these may be or how much his adjutants may urge him to attend to a particular matter, he refuses to take them seriously unless it happens to be a project which interests him. On the whole, few reports interest him unless they deal with military or naval affairs or political matters. He seldom sits in a cabinet meeting because they bore him. On several occasions when sufficient pressure was brought to bear, he did attend but got up abruptly during the session and left without apology. Later, it was discovered that he had gone to his private theater and had the operator show some film that he liked particularly. On the whole, he prefers to discuss cabinet members with each member in person, then communicate his decision to the group as a whole. He has a passion for the latest news and for photographs of himself. If Hoffman, the official party photographer, happens to appear or someone happens to enter his office with a newspaper, he will interrupt the most important meeting in order to scan through it. Very frequently he becomes so absorbed in the news or in his own photographs that he completely forgets the topic under discussion. Ludica writes, quote, "Even on ordinary days in those times, it was almost impossible to keep Hitler concentrated on one point. His quick mind would run away with the talk, or his attention would be distracted by the sudden discovery of the newspaper, and he would stop to read it avidly, or he would interrupt your carefully prepared report with a long speech as though you were an audience," unquote. And Hafschnagel reports that his staff is usually in despair on account of his procrastination. He never takes their protests in this respect very seriously and usually brushes them aside by saying, quote, "Problems are not solved by getting fidgety. If the time is ripe, the matter will be settled one way or another," unquote. Although Hitler tries to present himself as a very decisive individual who never hesitates when he is confronted by a difficult situation, he is usually far from it. It is at just these times that his procrastination becomes most marked. At such times it is almost impossible to get him to take action on anything. He stays very much by himself and is frequently almost inaccessible to his immediate staff. He often becomes depressed, is in bad humor, talks little, and prefers to read a book, look at movies, or play with architectural models. According to the Dutch report, his hesitation to act is not due to divergent views among his advisors. At such times he seldom pays very much attention to them and prefers not to discuss the matter. Quote, "What is known as the mastery of material was quite unimportant to him. He quickly became impatient if the details of a problem were brought to him. He was greatly adverse to experts and had little regard for their opinion. He looked upon them as mere hacks, as brush cleaners and color grinders," unquote. On some occasions he has been known to leave Berlin without a word and go to Berchtesgaden, where he spends his time walking in the country entirely by himself. Rauschning, who has met him on such occasions, says, quote, "He recognizes nobody then. He wants to be alone. There are times when he flees from human society," unquote. Rome frequently said, "Usually he solves suddenly, at the very last minute, a situation that has become intolerable and dangerous only because he vacillates and procrastinates," unquote. It is during these periods of inactivity that Hitler is waiting for his inner voice to guide him. He does not think the problem through in a normal way, but waits until the solution is presented to him. To Rauschning he said, quote, "Unless I have the incorruptible conviction this is the solution, I do nothing. Not even if the whole party tried to drive me to action. I will not act. I will wait, no matter what happens. But if the voice speaks, then I know the time has come to act," unquote. These periods of indecision may last from a few days to several weeks. If he is induced to talk about the problem during this time, he becomes ill-natured and bad-tempered. However, when the solution has been given to him, he has a great desire to express himself. He then calls in his adjutants, and they must sit and listen to him until he is finished, no matter what time it happens to be. On these occasions, he does not want them to question him or even to understand him. It seems that he just wants to talk. After this recital to his adjutants, Hitler calls in his advisors and informs them of his decision. When he is finished, they are free to express their opinions. If Hitler thinks that one of these opinions is worthwhile, he will listen for a long time, but usually these opinions have little influence on his decision when this stage has been reached. Only if someone succeeds in introducing new factors is there any possibility of getting him to change his mind. If someone voices the opinion that the proposed plan is too difficult or onerous, he becomes extremely angry and frequently says, quote, "I do not look for people having clever ideas of their own, but rather people who are clever in finding ways and means to carrying out my ideas," unquote. As soon as he has the solution to a problem, his mood changes very radically. He is again the Führer we have described at the beginning of this section. Quote, "He is very cheerful, jokes all the time, and does not give anybody an opportunity to speak, while he himself makes fun of everybody," unquote. This mood lasts throughout the period when necessary work has to be done. As soon as the requisite orders have been given to put the plan into execution, however, Hitler seems to lose interest in it. He becomes perfectly calm, occupies himself with other matters, and sleeps unusually long hours. This is a very fundamental trait in Hitler's character structure. He does not think things out in a logical and consistent fashion, gathering all available information pertinent to the problem, mapping out alternative courses of action, then weighing the evidence pro and con for each of them before reaching a decision. His mental processes operate in reverse. Instead of studying the problem as an intellectual would do, he avoids it and occupies himself with other things until unconscious processes furnish him with a solution. Having the solution, he then begins to look for facts which will prove that it is correct. In this procedure, he is very clever, and by the time he presents it to his associates, it has the appearance of a rational judgment. Nevertheless, his thought processes proceed from the emotional to the factual, instead of starting with the facts as an intellectual normally does. It is this characteristic of his thinking process which makes it difficult for ordinary people to understand Hitler or to predict his future actions. His orientation in this respect is that of an artist and not that of a statesman. Although Hitler has been extremely successful in using this inspirational technique in determining his course of action, and we are reminded of his following his course with the precision of a sleepwalker, it is not without its shortcomings. He becomes dependent on his inner guide, which makes for unpredictability on the one hand and rigidity on the other. The result is that he cannot modify his course in the face of unexpected developments or firm opposition. Strasser tells us that, quote, when he was then confronted by contradictory facts, he was left floundering, unquote. And Rome says that there is, quote, no system in the execution of his thoughts. He wants things his own way and gets mad when he strikes firm opposition on solid ground, unquote. This rigidity of mental functioning is obvious even in ordinary everyday interviews. When an unexpected question is asked, he is completely at a loss. Lochner supplies us with an excellent description of this reaction. Quote, I saw this seemingly super self-confident man actually blush when I broached the theme of German-American relations. This evidently caught him off guard. He was not used to having his infallibility challenged. For a moment he blushed like a schoolboy, hemmed and hawed, then stammered and embarrassed or something about having so many problems to ponder that he had not yet had time to take up America, unquote. Almost everyone who has written about Hitler has commented upon his rages. These are well known to all of his associates, and they have learned to fear them. The descriptions of his behavior during these rages vary considerably. The more extreme descriptions claim that at climax he rolls on the floor and chews on the carpets. Shirer reports that in 1938 he did this so often that his associates frequently referred to him as the Tippig-Fresher. Not one of our informants who has been close to Hitler, people like Hafstangl, Strasser, Rauschning, Hohenlohe, Friedlinde, Wagner, and Lüdecke, have ever seen him behave in this manner. Moreover, they are all firmly convinced that this is a gross exaggeration, and that the informant of the Dutch legation says that this aspect must be relegated to the domain of Gruelmärchen. Even without this added touch of chewing the carpet, his behavior is still extremely violent and shows an utter lack of emotional control. In the worst rages, he undoubtedly acts like a spoiled child who cannot have his own way and bangs his fist on the tables and walls. He scolds and shouts and stammers, and on some occasions foaming saliva gathers in the corners of his mouth. Rauschning, in describing one of these uncontrolled exhibitions, says, quote, he was an alarming sight, his hair disheveled, his eyes fixed, and his face distorted and purple. I feared that he would collapse or have a stroke, unquote. It must not be supposed, however, that these rages occur only when he is crossed on major issues. On the contrary, very insignificant matters might call out this reaction. In general, they are brought on whenever anyone contradicts him, when there is unpleasant news for which he might feel responsible, when there is any skepticism concerning his judgment, or when a situation arises in which his infallibility might be challenged or belittled. Von Wiegen reports that among his staff there is a tacit understanding, quote, for God's sake don't excite the Fuhrer, which means do not tell him bad news. Do not mention things which are not as he conceives them to be, unquote. Voigt says that, quote, close collaborators for many years said that Hitler was always like this, that the slightest difficulty or obstacle could make him scream with rage, unquote. Many writers believe that these rages are just play acting. There is much to be said for this point of view, since Hitler's first reaction to the unpleasant situation is not indignation, as one would ordinarily expect. He goes off into a rage or tirade without warning. Similarly, when he has finished, there is no aftermath. He immediately cools down and begins to talk about other matters in a perfectly calm tone of voice, as though nothing had happened. Occasionally he will look around sheepishly, as if to see if anyone is laughing, and then proceeds with other matters without the slightest trace of resentment. Some of his closest associates have felt that he induces these rages consciously to frighten those about him. Rauschning, for example, said it is a, quote, technique by which he would throw his entire entourage into confusion by well-timed fits of rage and thus make them more submissive, unquote. Strasser also believes this to be the case, for he says, rage and abuse became the favorite weapons in his armory, unquote. This is not the time to enter into a detailed discussion concerning the nature and purpose of the rages. It is sufficient, for the present time, to realize that his associates are well aware that Hitler can and does behave in this way. It is a part of the Hitler they know and are forced to deal with. We may point out, however, that they are not conscious acting alone, since it is almost impossible for an actor to actually become purple in the face unless he is really in an emotional state. There are many other aspects of Hitler's personality, as it is known to his associates, which do not fit into the picture of the Führer as it is presented to the German people. A few of the more important of these merit attention. Hitler is represented as a man of great courage, with nerves of steel, who is always in complete control of every situation. Nevertheless, he often runs away from an unpleasant, unexpected, or difficult situation. Bales reports 2 incidents that illustrate this reaction. Quote, particularly noticeable is his inability to cope with unexpected situations, this having been amusingly revealed when he laid the cornerstone of the House of the German Art in Munich. On this occasion he was handed a dainty Rococo hammer for delivering the 3 traditional strokes to the cornerstone, but not realizing the fragility of the Rococo, he brought the hammer down with such force that at the very first stroke it broke into bits. Then, instead of waiting for another hammer, Hitler completely lost his composure, blushed, looked wildly about him in the manner of a small boy caught stealing jam, and almost ran from the scene, leaving the cornerstone unlaid. His enjoyment of the Berlin Olympic Games was completely spoiled when a fanatical Dutch woman who had achieved a personal presentation suddenly clasped him in two hefty arms and tried to kiss him in plain view of 100,000 spectators. Hitler could not regain his composure or stand the irreverent guffaws of foreign visitors and left the stadium, unquote. This type of behavior is illustrated even more clearly in relation to Gregor Strasser because the occasion was one of extreme importance to Hitler. Strasser threatened to split the party if a definite program could not be agreed upon. Hitler avoided the situation as long as possibly he could in the hope that something might happen, that the situation would somehow solve itself. When it did not, he agreed to Strasser's demand for a meeting at Leipzig at which their differences could be thrashed out. Strasser was in the restaurant at the appointed hour. Hitler came late. Hardly had he sat down to the table when he excused himself in order to go to the toilet. Strasser waited for some time, and when Hitler did not return, he began making inquiries. To his amazement, he discovered that instead of going to the toilet, Hitler had slipped out the back door and driven back to Munich without discussing a single point. Haydn also tells us that in 1923 he was in conference with Ludendorff when he suddenly rushed off without as much as an apology. In the spring of 1932, he ran out on a meeting of the Verband Bayerischer Industrieller before he was to speak. This group was not kindly disposed to him, but it was important for Hitler to win them over. He got up to speak, and, quote, he falters, looks at the table, silence, everything looks itself blued. Embarrassing minutes. Hitler turns around on the heel and goes to the door without a word. The same thing happened a year later when, as Chancellor, he was to speak at the Reichsverband der Deutschen Presse. Again he sensed opposition to the group, and again he fled from the scene. Olden says, quote, this is a trick that the guide will still use often. When the situation becomes embarrassing, he hides. At other times, when he finds himself in difficult situations, the great dictator who prides himself on his decisiveness, hardness, and other leadership qualities breaks down and weeps like a child appealing for sympathy. Rauschning writes, quote, in 1934, as in 1932, he complained of the ingratitude of the German people in the sobbing tones of a down-at-the-heel music hall performer, a weakling who accused and sulked, appealed and implored, and retired in wounded vanity, quote, if the German people don't want me, unquote, instead of acting, quote. Otto Strasser reports that on one occasion, quote, he seized my hands as he had done 2 years before. His voice was choked with sobs and tears flowed down his cheeks, unquote. Haydn, reporting a scene at which the party leaders were waiting for the arrival of Gregor Strasser, quote, never would I have believed it of Strasser, Hitler cried, when he laid his head on the table and sobbed. Tears came to the eyes of many of those present as they saw their Führer weeping. Julius Streicher, who had been snubbed by Strasser for years, called out from his humble place in the background, shameful that Strasser should treat our Führer like that, unquote. In extremely difficult situations, he has openly threatened to commit suicide. Sometimes it seems that he uses this as a form of blackmail, while at other times the situation seems to be more than he can bear. During the Beer Hall Putsch, he said to the officials he was holding as prisoners, quote, "There are still 5 bullets in my pistol, 4 for the traitors, and 1, if things go wrong, for myself," unquote. He also threatened to commit suicide before Miss Hafstangl directly after the failure of the putsch, while he was hiding from the police in the Hafstangl home. Again in Landsberg, he went on a hunger strike and threatened to martyr himself, in imitation of the mayor of Cork. In 1930, he threatened to commit suicide after the strange murder of his niece Gelly, of whom we shall speak later. In 1932, he again threatened to carry out this action if Strasser split the party. In 1933, he threatened to do so if he was not appointed chancellor, and in 1936 he promised to do so if the occupation of the Rhineland failed. These, however, are relatively infrequent exhibitions, although his associates have learned that they are always a possibility and it is wise not to push the Führer too far. More frequent are his depressions, about which a great deal has been written. It is certain that he does have very deep depressions from time to time. During his years in Vienna, 1907-1912, he undoubtedly suffered from them a great deal. Honish reports, quote, "I have never seen such a helpless letting down in distress," unquote. It is probably also true that he suffered from depressions during the war, as Mend reports. After the death of his niece Gelly in 1930, he also went into a severe depression which lasted for some time. Gregor Strasser actually feared that he might commit suicide during this period and stayed with him for several days. There is some evidence that he actually tried to do so and was prevented from carrying it out. It is also interesting to note that for several years after her death, he went into a depression during the Christmas holidays and wandered around Germany alone for days on end. Rauschning gives us a vivid description of his condition after the blood purge of 1934, also known as the Night of Long Knives. He writes, quote, "But first of all, he did not give the impression of the winner. With dull, distorted blessings, he sat over me when I gave him a lecture. His eyes were extinguished. He did not look at me. He played with his fingers. I didn't have the impression that he belonged to me. During the whole time, I had the impression that disgust, weariness, and contempt were arguing within him, and that his thoughts were somewhere else. I had said that he should be able to sleep very soon. At night, he wandered around restlessly. Sleeping pills didn't help. With wine donuts, he should wake up from the short sleep. He had vomited repeatedly. With Schutelfrost, he sat in blankets in the armchair. Once he wanted everything, enlightened and many people around him. At the same moment, he would have wanted to see nobody again." These were major crises in his life, and we can assume that they probably represent his worst depressions. Undoubtedly, he very frequently has minor ones when he withdraws from his associates and broods by himself, or periods when he refuses to see anyone and is irritable and impatient with those around him. On the whole, however, it appears that the reports of Hitler's depressions have been grossly exaggerated. Not one of our informants who has had close contact with him has any knowledge of his ever retiring to a sanitarium during such times, and there is only one source which indicates that he ever sought psychiatric help, and that was not accepted. We must assume that the many reports that have flourished in the newspapers have been plants by the Nazi propaganda agencies to lure us into false expectations. There are a number of other respects in which Hitler does not appear before his associates as the self-confident Führer he likes to believe himself to be. One of the most marked of these is his behavior in the presence of accepted authority. Under these circumstances, he is obviously nervous and very ill at ease. Many times he is downright submissive. As far back as 1923, Ludica reports that, quote, "In conference with Poner, Hitler sat with his felt hat crushed shapeless in his hands. His mien was almost humble," unquote. Fromm writes that at a dinner, quote, "Hitler's eagerness to obtain the good graces of the princes present was subject to much comment. He bowed and clicked, and all but knelt in his zeal to please oversized, ugly Princess Louise von Sachsen-Meiningen, her brother, hereditary Prince George, and their sister, Grand Duchess of Saxon-Weimar. Beaming in his servile attitude, he dashed personally to bring refreshments from the buffet," unquote. On his visit to Rome, Huss writes, quote, "When leading Queen Helene in Rome, he was like a fish out of water. He didn't know what to do with his hands," unquote. To Hindenburg, he was extremely submissive. Pictures taken of their meetings illustrate his attitude very clearly. In some of them, it looks almost as though he were about to kiss the president's hand. Flannery also reports that when Hitler first met Pétain, They took him by the arm and escorted him to his car. Hafstangl reports that he found Hitler outside the door of the banquet hall in which a dinner and reception were being given to the former Kaiser's wife. He was unable to bring himself to go in and meet Her Highness alone. When Hafstangl finally persuaded Hitler to go in, he was so ill at ease that he could only stammer a few words to Hermine and then excused himself. Many other examples could be cited. From the weight of evidence, it seems certain that Hitler does lose his self-confidence badly when he is brought face to face with an accepted authority of high standing, particularly royalty. This subservient attitude is also obvious in his use of titles. This is well described by Lania, reporting on Hitler's trial. He avoids contact with them as much as possible. Fromm describes his behavior at a diplomatic dinner in the following words, quote, "The corporal seemed to be ill at ease, awkward and moody. His coat-tails embarrassed him. Again and again his hand fumbled for the encouraging support of his sword belt. Each time he missed the familiar cold and bracing support, his uneasiness grew. He crumpled his handkerchief, tugged it, rolled it, just plain stage fright." Unquote. Many others have also commented on this tendency to use the full title. It also fits in with his very submissive behavior to his officers during the last war, which has been commented upon by several of his comrades. It seems safe to assume that this is a fundamental trait in his character, which becomes less obvious as he climbs the ladder, but it is present nevertheless. The Führer is also ill at ease in the company of diplomats, and, quote, "In the course of his peroration he came to speak at Generals Ludendorff and von Seeckt. At such moments he stood at attention and trumpeted forth the words General and Excellency. It made no difference that one of the generals was on his side, while the other, von Seeckt, commander-in-chief of the Reichswehr, was his enemy. He abandoned himself entirely to the pleasure of pronouncing the high-sounding titles. He never said General Seeckt, he said His Excellency, Herr General von Seeckt, letting the words melt on his tongue and savoring their aftertaste." Unquote. Henderson writes, quote, "It will always be a matter of regret to me that I was never able to study Hitler in private life, as this might have given me the chance to see him under normal conditions and to talk with him as man to man. Except for a few brief words at chance meetings, I never met him except upon official and invariably disagreeable business. He never attended informal parties at which diplomats might be present, and when friends of mine did try to arrange it, he always got out of meeting me in such a manner on the ground of precedent. But he always looked self-conscious when he had to entertain the diplomatic corps, which happened normally 3 times a year." Unquote. Hitler also becomes nervous and tends to lose his composure when he has to meet newspapermen. Being a genius of propaganda, he realizes the power of the press in influencing public opinion, and he always provides the press with choice seats at all ceremonies. When it comes to interviews, however, he feels himself on the defensive and insists that the questions be submitted in advance. When the interview takes place, he is able to maintain considerable poise because he has his answers prepared. Even then, he gives no opportunity to ask for further clarification because he immediately launches into a lengthy dissertation which sometimes develops into a tirade. When this is finished, the interview is over. He is also terrified when he is called upon to speak to intellectuals or any group in which he feels opposition or the possibility of criticism. Hitler's adjustment to people in general is very poor. He is not really on intimate terms with any of his associates. Hess is the only associate, with the possible exception of Streicher, who has ever had the privilege of addressing him with the familiar "du." Even Goering, Goebbels, and Himmler must address him with the more formal "Sie," although each of them would undoubtedly be willing to sacrifice his right hand for the privilege of addressing him in the informal manner. It is true that outside of his official family there are a few people in Germany, notably Miss Beckstein and the Winifred Wagner family, who address him as "du" and call him by his nickname Wolf, but even these are few and far between. On the whole, he always maintains a considerable distance from other people. Luedecke, who was very close to him for a while, writes, quote, "Even in his intimate and cozy moments, I sensed no attitude of familiarity towards him on the part of his staff. There was always a certain distance about him, that subtle quality of aloofness." Unquote. And Fry says, quote, "He lives in the midst of many men, and yet he lives alone." Unquote. It is well known that he cannot carry out a normal conversation or discussion with people. Even if only one person is present, he must do all the talking. His manner of speech soon loses any conversational qualities it might have had, and takes on all the characteristics of a lecture, and may easily develop into a tirade. He simply forgets his companions and behaves as though he were addressing a multitude. Strasser has given a good brief description of his manner, quote, "Now Hitler drew himself erect, and by the faraway look in his eyes showed plainly that he was not speaking merely to me. He was addressing an imaginary audience that stretched far beyond the walls of the living room, unquote. This is not only true in connection with political matters. Even when he is alone with his adjutants or immediate staff and tries to be friendly, he is unable to enter into a give-and-take conversation. At times he seems to want to get closer to people and relates personal experiences such as when I was in Vienna or when I was in the army. But under these circumstances, too, he insists on doing all the talking and always repeats the same stories over and over again in exactly the same form, almost as though he had memorized them. The gist of most of these stories is contained in Mein Kampf. His friends have all heard them dozens of times, but this does not deter him from repeating them again with great enthusiasm. Nothing but the most superficial aspects of these experiences are ever touched upon. It seems as though he is unable to give more of himself than that. Price says that, quote, when more than two people are present, even though they are his intimate circle, there is no general discourse. Either Hitler talks and they listen, or else they talk among themselves and Hitler sits silent, unquote. And this is the way it seems to be. He is not at all annoyed when members of the group talk to each other, unless, of course, he feels like doing the talking himself. But ordinarily, he seems to enjoy listening to others while he makes believe that he is attending to something else. Nevertheless, he overhears everything which is being said and often uses it later. However, he does not give credit to the individual from whom he has learned it, but simply gives it out as his own. Rauschning says, quote, he has always been a poseur. He remembers things that he has heard and has a faculty for repeating them in such a way that the listener is led to believe that they are his own, unquote. Rome also complained of this, stating, quote, if you try to tell him anything, he knows everything already. Though he often does what we advise, he laughs in our faces at the moment, and later does the very thing as if it were all his own idea and creation. He doesn't even seem to be aware of how dishonest he is, unquote. Another one of his tricks which drives people, and particularly his associates, to distraction is his capacity for forgetting. This trait has been commented upon so much that it scarcely needs mentioning here. We all know how he can say something one day and a few days later say the opposite, completely oblivious of his earlier statement. He does not only do this in connection with international affairs, but also with his closest associates. When they show their dismay and call his attention to the inconsistency, he flies off into a rage and demands to know if the other person thinks he is a liar. Evidently, the other leading Nazis have also learned the trick. For Rauschning says, quote, most of the Nazis with Hitler at their head literally forget, like hysterical women, anything they have no desire to remember, unquote. Although Hitler almost invariably introduces a few humorous elements into his speeches and gives the impression of considerable wit, he seems to lack any real sense of humor. He can never take on a joke on himself. Haste says he is unable to purify his gloomy self with self-irony and humor, unquote. Von Weigen says he is extremely sensitive to ridicule, and Huss says that, quote, he takes himself seriously and will flare up in a temperamental rage at the least impingement by act or attitude on the dignity and holiness of state and furor, unquote. When everything is going well, he sometimes gets into a gay and whimsical mood in a circle of close friends. His humor then is confined almost wholly to a kind of teasing or ribbing. The ribbing is usually in connection with alleged love affairs of his associates, but are never vulgar and only hint at sexual factors. Friedlinde Wagner provides us with an example of his teasing. Goering and Goebbels were both present at the time that he said to the Wagner family, quote, you all know what a volt is and an ampere, don't you? Right. But do you know what a Goebbels and a Goering are? A Goebbels is the amount of nonsense a man can speak in an hour, and a Goering is the amount of metal that can be pinned on a man's breast, unquote. His other form of humor is mimicking. Almost everyone concedes that he has a great talent along these lines, and he frequently mimics his associates in their presence, much to the amusement of everyone except the victim. He also loved to mimic Sir Eric Phipps and later Chamberlain. Hitler's poor adaptation to people is perhaps most obvious in his relations to women. Since he has become a political figure, his name has been linked with a great many women, particularly in the foreign press. Although the German public seems to know very little about this phase of his life, his associates have seen a great deal of it, and the topic is always one for all kinds of conjectures. Roughly speaking, his relations to women fall into three categories. A. Much older women. B. Actresses and passing fancies. And C. More or less enduring relationships. A. As early as 1920, Frau Carola Hoffmann, now a 61-year-old widow, took him under her wing and for years played the part of foster mother. Then came Frau Helena Bechstein, the wife of the famous Berlin piano manufacturer, who took over the role. She spent large quantities of money on Hitler in the early days of the party, introduced him to her social circle, and lavished maternal affection on him. She often said that she wished that Hitler were her son, and while he was imprisoned in Landsberg, she claimed that she was his adopted mother in order that she might visit him. Strasser says that Hitler would often sit at her feet and lay his head against her bosom while she stroked his hair tenderly and murmured, "Mein Wolfchen." Since he came to power, things have not gone so smoothly. She seemed to find fault with everything he did and would scold him unmercifully, even in public. According to Friedlinde Wagner, she is the one person in Germany who can carry on a monologue in Hitler's presence and who would actually tell him what she thought. During these violent scoldings, Hitler would stand there like an abashed schoolboy who had committed a misdemeanor. According to Hafstengel, Miss Bechstein had groomed Hitler in the expectation that he would marry her daughter, Lotte, who was far from attractive. Out of a sense of obligation, Hitler did ask Lotte, but was refused. Miss Bechstein was disconsolate over the failure of her plans and began to criticize Hitler's social reforms as well as his actions. Nevertheless, Hitler made duty calls fairly regularly, even though he postponed them as long as possible. Then there was also Frau Victoria von Dirksen, who was alleged to have spent a fortune on him and his career, and a number of others. In more recent years, Miss Goebbels has taken over the role of foster mother and looks after his comforts, supervises his household, and bakes delicacies of which he is particularly fond. She too has been acting as a matchmaker in the hope that he might marry one of her friends and thereby draw the bond between them even tighter. To Ludica she complained, quote, "I am no good as a matchmaker. I would leave him alone with my most charming friends, but he wouldn't respond," unquote. There was also his half-older sister, Angela, who kept house for him at Munich and Berchtesgaden, and for a time seemed to play a mother's role. Winifred Wagner, the daughter-in-law of Richard Wagner, has also caused a great deal of comment. She is English by birth and from all accounts is very attractive and about Hitler's own age. She met Hitler in the early 1920s and since that time has been one of his staunch supporters. He became a frequent visitor at the Wagner home in Bayreuth and after his accession to power built a house on the Wagner estate for himself and his staff. After the death of Siegfried Wagner, reports all over the world had it that she would become Hitler's wife. But nothing happened in spite of the fact it seemed like an ideal union from the point of view of both parties. Nevertheless, Hitler continued to be a frequent guest at the Wagners. It probably was the nearest thing to a home he has known since his own home broke up in 1907. Miss Wagner undoubtedly did everything in her power to make him comfortable, and Hitler felt very much at home. There were 3 small children, a boy and 2 girls. One of them is our informant, Friedlinde, which added considerably to the home atmosphere. The entire family called him by his nickname Wolf and addressed him as Du. He felt so secure in this house that he often came and stayed without his bodyguard. He sometimes spent his Christmas holidays with the family and became very much a part of it. But further than that, he was unwilling to go, even though the marriage would have been exceedingly popular with the German people. Then there were a long line of passing fancies. For the most part, these were screen and stage stars. Hitler likes to be surrounded with pretty women and usually requests the moving picture companies send over a number of actresses whenever there is a party in the Chancellery. He seems to get an extraordinary delight in fascinating these girls with stories about what he is going to do in the future or the same old stories about his past life. He also likes to impress them with his power by ordering the studios to provide them with better roles or promising that he will see to it that they are starred in some forthcoming picture. Most of his associations with women of this type, and their number is legion, does not go beyond this point as far as we've been able to discover. On the whole, he seems to feel more comfortable in the company of stage people than with any other group, and often went down to the studio restaurants for lunch. See, there have been several other women who have played a more or less important role in Hitler's life. The first of which we have any knowledge of was Henny Hoffmann, the daughter of the official party photographer. Henny, according to reports, was little more than a prostitute and spent most of her time among the students in Munich, who alleged that she could be had for a few marks. Heinrich Hoffmann, her father, was a member of the party and a close friend of Hitler. By a queer twist of fate, Hoffmann had taken a picture of the crowds in Munich at the outbreak of the last war. Later, when Hitler became prominent in Munich politics, Hoffmann discovered Hitler in the picture and called it to his attention. Hitler was delighted and a close relationship sprung up between them. Hoffmann's wife was also very fond of Hitler and played a mother role towards him for a time. With the death of Mrs. Hoffman, the home went to pieces from a moral point of view and became a kind of meeting place for homosexuals of both sexes. There was a good deal of drinking and great freedom in sexual activities of all kinds. Hitler was frequently present at parties given in the Hoffman home and became very friendly with Henny. The relationship continued for some time until Henny, who was a very garrulous person by nature, got drunk one night and began to talk about her relationship to Hitler. Her father became enraged and for a time had little to do with Hitler. Up to this time, Hitler had steadfastly refused to have his photograph taken for publication on the grounds that it was better publicity to remain a mystery man, and also because if his picture appeared, it would be too easy to identify him when he crossed communist territories. Shortly after the above described episode, Hitler named Hoffman as official party photographer and gave him the exclusive right to his photographs. These privileges, so it is alleged, have, in the course of years, netted Hoffman millions of dollars. Among Hitler's associates, it was supposed that Hitler had committed some kind of sexual indiscretion with Henny and bought Hoffman's silence by granting him these exclusive rights. In any event, Henny was soon married to Baldur von Schirach, the leader of the Nazi youth movement who was reputed to be a homosexual. His family were violently opposed to the marriage, but Hitler insisted. All differences between Hitler and Hoffman seem to have disappeared, and today he is one of Hitler's closest associates and exerts a great personal influence on the Führer. We shall consider the nature of Hitler's indiscretion later in our study, since it is not a matter of common knowledge and would lead us too far afield at the present time. After the Henny-Hoffman episode, Hitler began to appear in public with his niece, Geli, the daughter of his half-sister, Angela, who had come to keep house for Hitler in 1924. At the time this relationship matured, her mother had gone to Berchtesgaden and Hitler and Geli were living alone in his Munich flat. They became inseparable companions and the subject of much comment in party circles. Many of the members, particularly Gregor Strasser, felt that this was poor publicity and was creating a good deal of unfavorable talk. Other members had Hitler brought on the carpet to explain where he was getting the money to clothe Geli and sport her around if he was not using party funds for this purpose. Hitler became very jealous of Geli's attention and refused to let her go out with any other men. Some claim that he kept her locked in during the day when he could not take her with him. For several years the relationship continued over the opposition of the party. Then one day Geli was found dead in Hitler's apartment. She had died from a bullet fired from Hitler's revolver. There was considerable commotion. The coroner's verdict was suicide, but Geli was buried in hallowed ground by a Catholic clergy. There was much speculation whether she killed herself or was killed by Hitler. Whatever the facts may be, Hitler went into a profound depression, which lasted for months. During the first days after the funeral, Gregor Strasser remained with him in order to prevent him from committing suicide. Ludicus says, quote, "The special quality of Hitler's affection for Geli is still a mystery to those closest to him," unquote. For a few years after Geli's death, Hitler had little to do with women, except in a very superficial way. Along about 1932, however, he became interested in Eva Braun, Hoffman's photographic assistant. This relationship did not develop very rapidly, but it has continued. In the course of time, Hitler has bought her many things, including high-powered automobiles and a house between Munich and Berchtesgaden, where it is alleged he frequently spends the night on the way to or from his country estate. Eva Braun is also frequently a guest at Berchtesgaden and in Berlin. Ochsner was told that after one of her visits in Berchtesgaden, some of her underwear was found in Hitler's bedroom. Wiedemann, according to Hohenlohe, says that she has sometimes spent the entire night in Hitler's bedroom in Berlin. It is reported by Norbert that Eva moved into the Chancellery on December 16th, 1939, and it is said that Hitler intends to marry her when the war is over. Beyond that, we know nothing about this affair except that Eva Braun has twice tried to commit suicide, and that one of Hitler's bodyguards hurled himself from the Kelstein because he was in love with her but could not trespass on the Führer's domain. The affair with Eva Braun was not exclusive, however. During this period, he's also seen a good deal of at least two moving picture actresses. These have been much more enduring than most of his associations with actresses and much more intimate. Both of these girls were frequently invited to the Chancellery late at night and departed in the early hours of the morning. During their stay, they were alone with Hitler behind closed doors, so that not even his immediate staff knew what transpired between them. The first of these relationships was with Renate Müller, who committed suicide by throwing herself from the window of a Berlin hotel. The other was with Leni Riefenstahl, who continued to be a guest at the Chancellery up to the outbreak of the war. Hitler's associates know that in respect to women, Hitler is far from the ascetic he and the Propaganda Bureau would like to have the German public believe. None of them, with the possible exception of Hoffmann and Schaub, his personal adjutant, know the nature of his sexual activities. This has led to a great deal of conjecture in party circles. There are some who believe that his sex life is perfectly normal but restricted, others that he is immune from such temptations, and that nothing happens when he is alone with girls. Still others believe that he is a homosexual. The latter belief is based largely on the fact that during the early days of the party, many of the inner circle were well-known homosexuals. Röhm made no attempt to hide his homosexual activities, and Hess was generally known as Fraulein Anna. There were also many others, and it was supposed for this reason that Hitler too belonged to this category. In view of Hitler's pretense at purity and the importance of his mission for building a greater Germany, it is extraordinary that he should be so careless about his associates. He has never restricted them in any way except at the time of the Blood Purge in 1934, when his excuse was that he had to purge the party of these undesirable elements. At all other times he has been liberal to a fault. Lochner reports, quote, "The only criterion for membership in the party was that the applicant be unconditionally obedient and faithfully devoted to me. When someone asked if that applied to thieves and criminals, Hitler said, 'Their private lives do not concern me,'" unquote. Lüdecke claims that in speaking of some of the moralists who were complaining about the actions of his SA men, Hitler said, quote, "He would rather his SA men took the women than some fat-bellied money bag. Why should I concern myself with the private lives of my followers? Apart from Röhm's achievements, I know that I can absolutely depend on him," unquote. Rauschning says that the general attitude in the party was, do anything you like, but don't get caught at it. This attitude towards his associates certainly did not make for high standards in the party. Captain von Mucke resigned from the party on the grounds that the Völkische Partei is no longer the party of the right people. It is run down and corrupt. In short, this is a mess. Rauschning expresses a similar sentiment. Quote, "Most loathsome of all is the reeking miasma of furtive, unnatural sexuality that fills and fouls the whole atmosphere around him like an evil emanation. Nothing in this environment is straightforward. Surreptitious relationships, substitutes and symbols, false sentiments and secret lusts. Nothing in this man's surroundings is natural and genuine. Nothing has the openness of a natural instinct," unquote. One of Hitler's hobbies, which is carefully hidden from the public, is his love for pornography. He can scarcely wait for the next edition of Der Stürmer to appear, and when it reaches him, he goes through it avidly. He seems to get great pleasure out of the dirty stories and the cartoons that feature this sheet. To Rauschning, Hitler said that the Stürmer was a form of pornography permitted in the Third Reich. In addition, Hitler has a large collection of nudes, and according to Hafstengel and others, he also enjoys viewing lewd movies in his private theater, some of which are prepared by Hoffmann for his benefit. He also likes to present himself as a great authority and lover of good music. One of his favorite pastimes is to lecture on Wagner and the beauty of his operatic music. There can be no doubt concerning his enjoyment of Wagnerian music and that he gets considerable inspiration from it. Oxner reports that he has been able to observe Hitler closely while he was listening to music and saw grimaces of pain and pleasure contort his face, his brows knit, his eyes close, his mouth contract tightly. Hitler has said, quote, "For me, Wagner is something godly, and his music is my religion. I go to his concerts as others go to church," unquote. According to Hafstengel, however, he is not a lover of good music in general. He says that about 85% of Hitler's preferences in music are the normal program music in Viennese cafes. This is probably why Hitler rarely attends concerts and in later years seldom goes to the opera. His preferences now seem to run to musical comedies and cabarets, in addition to the movies he sees at the Chancellery. Pope says that Hitler frequently visited The Merry Widow, in which an American actress played the lead. He says, "I have seen Hitler nudge his Gauleiter, Wagner, and smirk when Dorothy does her famous backbending number in the spotlight," unquote. In this number, Dorothy's costume consists of a pair of transparent butterfly wings, or sometimes nothing at all. Hitler watches the performance through opera glasses, and sometimes has command performances for his private benefit. Much has been written by the Nazi Propaganda Bureau about his modest way of living. This, through the eyes of his associates, has also been vastly overrated. Although he is a vegetarian, most of them feel that his meals are scarcely to be considered as a form of deprivation. He eats large quantities of eggs, prepared in 101 different ways by the best chef in Germany, and there are always quantities and a large variety of fresh vegetables prepared in unusual ways. In addition, Hitler consumes incredible quantities of pastries and often as much as 2 pounds of chocolates in the course of a single day. Nor are his personal tastes particularly inexpensive. Although his clothes are simple, he has an incredible number of each article of clothing. All are made of the finest materials that can be procured and made up by the best workmen. He also has a passion for collecting paintings, and when he has his heart set on one, the sky is the limit as far as the price is concerned. The only thing that is really modest about his living arrangements is his bedroom, which is extremely simple and contains only a white metal bed decorated with ribbons at the head, a painted chest of drawers, and a few straight chairs. Friedlinde Wagner and Hofstangl, both of whom have seen the room with their own eyes, have described it in identical terms, namely that it is a room that one would expect a maid to have, and not a chancellor. Although he is presented to the German public as a man of extraordinary courage, his immediate associates frequently have occasion to question this. Several occasions have been reported on which he has not carried through his own program because he feared opposition. This is particularly true in connection with his Gauleiters. He seems to have a particular fear of these people, and rather than meet opposition from them, he usually tries to find out on which side of an issue the majority have aligned themselves before he meets with them. When the meeting takes place, he proposes a plan of course of action, which will fit in with the sentiments of the majority. According to Hohenlohe, he also backed down before 3 army generals when they protested against the rapid developments in the Danzig question, and that before Munich he decided to postpone the war because he discovered that the crowds watching the troops marching under the chancellery windows were unenthusiastic. Furthermore, they must wonder about the necessity of the extreme precautions that are taken for his safety. Most of these are carefully concealed from the German public. When Hitler appears, he looks for all the world like an extremely brave man as he stands up in the front seat of his open car and salutes. The people do not know of the tremendous number of Secret Service men who constantly mingle with the crowds, in addition to the guards who line the streets through which he is to pass. Neither do they know of all the precautions taken at the Chancellery or Berchtesgaden. Before the war, his house at Berchtesgaden was surrounded with 8 miles of electrified wire. Pillboxes and anti-aircraft batteries were set up in the surrounding hills. When he visited Bayreuth, troops were sent in weeks in advance to set up machine gun nests and anti-aircraft batteries in the hills immediately adjoining. Lochner reports that when he travels in a special train, he is accompanied by 200 SS guards who are more heavily armed than the retinue of any German emperor. After the war started, his train was heavily armored and equipped with anti-aircraft fore and aft. And yet, when the newsreels show him at the front, he is the only one who does not wear a steel helmet. There is consequently a considerable discrepancy between Hitler as he is known to the German people and Hitler as he is known to his associates. Nevertheless, it appears that most of his associates have a deep allegiance to Hitler, personally, and are quite ready to forgive or ignore his shortcomings. In many cases, it seems as though his associates are quite oblivious to the contradictory traits in his character. To them he is still the Führer, and they live for the moments when he actually plays this role. Part 4. Hitler as he knows himself. Hitler has always been extremely secretive in all his dealings. Hofstangl tells us that this trait is carried to such a degree that he never tells one of his immediate associates what he has been talking about or arranged with another. His mind is full of compartments. Hofstangl says, and his dealings with every individual are carefully pigeonholed. What has been filed in one pigeonhole is never permitted to mix with that in another. Everything is scrupulously kept locked up in his mind and is only opened when he needs the material. This is also true of himself. We have also seen already how he has steadfastly refused to divulge anything about his past to his associates. This, he believed, was something which did not concern them in any way, and consequently has kept the pigeonhole tightly closed. He talks almost continually about everything under the sun, except himself. What really goes on in his mind is almost as great a mystery as his past life. Nevertheless, it would be helpful and interesting to open this pigeonhole and examine its contents. Fortunately, a few fragments of information concerning his past life have been unearthed in the course of time, and these are extremely valuable as a background for understanding his present behavior. Then, too, we have records and attitudes and sentiments expressed in speeches and writings. Although these utterances are confined to a rather limited area, they do represent the products of some of his mental processes, and consequently give us some clue of what goes on behind those much-discussed eyes, of which Rauschning writes, quote, Anyone who has seen this man face to face, has met his uncertain glance, without depth or warmth, from eyes that seem hard and remote, and has then seen that gaze grow rigid, will certainly have experienced the uncanny feeling that that man is not normal, unquote. In addition, we have descriptions of his overt behavior in the face of varied circumstances. We must assume that these two are the products of his psychological processes, and that they reflect what is going on behind the scenes. All of this, however, would be insufficient data for an adequate picture of Hitler, as he knows himself in everyday life. Fortunately, patients with behavior patterns, tendencies, and sentiments very similar to those of Hitler, as expressed, are not unknown in psychoanalytical practice. From our knowledge of what goes on in the minds of these patients, together with the knowledge of their past histories, it may be possible to fill in some of the gaps and make some deductions concerning his extraordinary mode of adjustment. We have learned from the study of many cases that the present character of an individual is the product of an evolutionary process, the beginnings of which are to be found in infancy. The very earliest experiences in the lifetime of the individual form the foundation upon which the character is gradually structured as the individual passes through successive stages of development and is exposed to the demands and influences of the world around him. If this is true, it would be well for us to review briefly Hitler's past history, as far as it is known, in the hope that it may cast some light upon his present behavior and the course he is most likely to pursue in the future. Such a review of his past is also pertinent to our study insofar as it forms the background through which Hitler sees himself. It is a part of him he must live with, whether he likes it or not. The Hitler family. Father. There is a great deal of confusion in studying Hitler's family tree. Much of this is due to the fact that the name has been spelled in various ways: Hitler, Hidler, Heidler, and Hütler. It seems reasonable to suppose, however, that it is fundamentally the same name spelled in various ways by different members of what was basically an illiterate peasant family. Adolf Hitler himself signed his name Hitler, Hittler, on the first party membership blanks, and his sister usually spells her name Hiedler. Another element of confusion is introduced by the fact that Adolf's mother's mother was also named Hitler, which later became the family name of his father. Some of this confusion is dissipated, however, when we realize that Adolf's parents had a common ancestor, father's grandfather and mother's great-grandfather, an inhabitant of the culturally backward Waldviertel district of Austria. Adolf's father, Alois Hitler, was the illegitimate son of Maria Anna Schicklgruber. It is generally supposed that the father of Alois Hitler was Johann Georg Heidler, a miller's assistant. Alois, who, however, was not legitimized and bore his mother's name until he was 40 years of age when he changed it to Hitler. Just why this was done is not clear, but it is generally said among the villagers that it was necessary in order to obtain a legacy. Where the legacy came from is unknown. One could suppose that Johann Georg Heidler relented on his deathbed and left an inheritance to his illegitimate son together with his name. It seems strange, however, that he did not legitimize the son when he married Anna Schicklgruber 35 years earlier. Why the son chose to take the name Hitler instead of Heidler, if this is the case, is also a mystery which has remained unsolved. Unfortunately, the date of the death of Heidler has not been established, and consequently we are unable to relate two of these events in time. A particular series of events prior to Hitler's birth furnishes plenty of food for speculation. There are some people who seriously doubt that Johann Georg Heidler was the father of Alois. Thiessen and Kohler, for example, claim that Chancellor Dollfuss had ordered the Austrian police to conduct a thorough investigation into the Hitler family. As a result of this investigation, a secret document was prepared which proved that Maria Anna Schicklgruber was living in Vienna at the time she conceived. At that time, she was employed as a servant in the home of Baron Rothschild. As soon as the family discovered her pregnancy, she was sent back to her home in Spital, where Alois was born. If it is true that one of the Rothschilds is the real father of Alois Hitler, it would make Adolf a quarter Jew. According to these sources, Adolf Hitler knew of the existence of this document and the incriminating evidence it contained. In order to obtain it, he precipitated events in Austria and initiated the assassination of Dollfuss. According to this story, he failed to obtain the document at that time, since Dollfuss had it secreted and had told Schuschnigg of its whereabouts so that in the event of his death, the independence of Austria would remain assured. Several stories of this general character are in circulation. Those who lend credence to this story point out several factors which seem to favor its plausibility. A. That it is unlikely that the miller's assistant in a small village in this district would have very much to leave in the form of a legacy. B. That it is strange that Johann Heidler should not claim the boy until 35 years after he had married the mother and the mother had died. C. That if the legacy were left by Heidler on the condition that Alois take his name, it would not have been possible for him to change it to Hitler. D. That the intelligence and behavior of Alois was, as well as that of his two sons, is completely out of keeping with that usually found in Austrian peasant families. They point out that their ambitiousness and extraordinary political intuition is much more in harmony with the Rothschild tradition. E. That Alois Schicklgruber left his home village at an early age to seek his fortune in Vienna, where his mother had worked. F. That it would be peculiar for Alois Hitler, while working as a customs official in Braunau, to choose a Jew named Prince of Vienna to act as Adolph's godfather unless he felt some kinship with the Jews himself. This is certainly a very intriguing hypothesis, and much of Adolph's later behavior could be explained in rather easy terms on this basis. However, it is not absolutely necessary to assume that he has Jewish blood in his veins in order to make a comprehensive picture of his character with his manifold traits and sentiments. From a purely scientific point of view, therefore, it is sounder not to base our reconstruction on such slim evidence, but to seek firmer foundations. Nevertheless, we can leave it as a possibility which requires further verification. In any event, Maria Anna Schicklgruber died when Alois was 5 years of age. When he was 13, he left the Waldviertel and went to Vienna, where he learned to be a cobbler. The next 23 years of his life are largely unaccounted for. It seems probable that during this time he joined the army and had perhaps been advanced to the rank of non-commissioned officer. His service in the army may have helped him enter the civil service as Zollamtsoffizial later on. His married life was stormy. His first wife, born Gleisel Hörer, was about 13 years older than himself. She is alleged to have been the daughter of one of his superiors and seems to have been in poor health. In any event, the marriage turned out badly, and they finally separated. Since Catholics, a complete divorce was not possible. His first wife died in 1883. In January 1882, Franziska Matzelberger gave birth to an illegitimate son who was named Alois. After the death of his first wife on April 6, 1883, Alois Hitler married Franziska Matzelberger on May 22, 1883, and legitimized his son. On July 28, 1883, his second wife bore him another child, Angela, and a year later, on August 10, 1884, she also died. During the time of his first marriage, the couple had taken as a foster daughter Clara Posel, Alois Hitler's second cousin once removed. He had reared her up to the time of the separation from his first wife, when she went to Vienna as a servant. During the last months of the life of his second wife, Clara Posel returned to his home to look after the invalid and the two children. She remained in his home as housekeeper after the death of his second wife, and on January 7, 1885, he married her. On May 17, 1885, she gave birth to a son who died in infancy. It is alleged by William Patrick Hitler, Adolph's nephew, that an illegitimate child was born previously, but we have no other record of this. In any event, at least one child was conceived out of wedlock. 4 more children were born of this union. This is certainly a tempestuous married life for a customs officer. 3 wives, 7 or possibly 8 children, 1 divorce, at least 1 birth and possibly 2 before marriage, 2 directly after the wedding, 1 wife 13 years older than himself, and another 23 years younger, 1 the daughter of a superior, 1 a waitress, and the 3rd a servant and his foster daughter. All of this, of course, has never been mentioned by Hitler. In Mein Kampf, he gives a very simple picture of conditions in his father's home. Relatively little is known about Alois Hitler. It seems that he was very proud of his achievements in the civil service, and yet he retired from this service at the astonishing age of 56, 4 years after Adolf was born. In very rapid succession, the family moved into several different villages, and the father tried his hand at farming. It is said, however, that he always wore his customs of Union's official uniform and insisted on being addressed as Herr Oberoffizial Hitler. According to reports, he liked to lord it over his neighbors, whom he may have looked down upon as mere peasants. In any event, it seems quite certain that he enjoyed sitting in the tavern and relating his adventures as a customs official, and also in discussing political topics. He died on his way to the tavern in Leonding from a stroke of apoplexy in 1903. He is generally described as a very domineering individual who was a veritable tyrant in his home. William Patrick Hitler says that he has heard from his father, Adolph's elder half-brother, that he used to beat the children unmercifully. On one occasion, it is alleged that he beat the older son into a state of unconsciousness, and on another occasion beat Adolph so severely that he left him for dead. It is also alleged that he was somewhat of a drunkard, and that frequently the children would have to bring him home from the taverns. When he reached home, a grand scene would take place during which he would beat his wife, children, and dog rather indiscriminately. Although this story is rather generally accepted, it is probably an exaggeration. Haydn, who interviewed a number of the villagers in various places where the family had lived, could not find substantiating evidence. Many found the old man rather amusing and claimed that his home life was fairly happy and quiet, except when his wife's sister came to visit with the family. Why this should be a disturbing factor is unknown. Haydn suspects that the legacy was a bone of contention. There is also some doubt about the complexion of Alois Hitler's political sentiments. Hannisch reports, quote, Hitler heard from his father only praise of Germany and all the faults of Austria, unquote. According to Haydn, more reliable informants claim that the father, though full of complaints and criticisms of the government he served, was by no means a German nationalist. They say he favored Austria against Germany, and this coincides with William Patrick Hitler's information that his grandfather was definitely anti-German, just as his own father was. Mother. Clara Pölzl, as has been said, was the foster daughter of her husband, and 23 years his junior. She came from old peasant stock, was hard-working, energetic, pious, and conscientious. Whether it was due to her years of domestic service or to her upbringing, her home was always spotlessly clean. Everything had its place, and not a speck of dust was to be found on the furniture. She was very devoted to her children, and according to William Patrick Hitler, was a typical stepmother to her stepchildren. According to Dr. Bloch, who treated her, she was a very quiet, sweet, affectionate woman whose life centered around her children and particularly Adolph, who was her pet. She spoke highly of her husband and the life they had together. She felt it was a real deprivation for the children to have lost their father while they were still so young. One could question her background. Her sister is married and has 2 sons, one of whom is a hunchback and has an impediment in his speech. When we consider that Clara Pölzl may have lost 1 child before her marriage to Alois Hitler, another son born in 1885 who died in 1887, another son born in 1894 who died in 1900, and a girl who was born in 1886 and died in 1888, one has grounds to question the purity of the blood. There is even cause for greater suspicion when we learn from Dr. Bloch that he is certain that there was a daughter slightly older than Adolf who was an imbecile. He is absolutely certain of this because he noticed at the time that the family always tried to hide the child and keep her out of the way when he came to attend the mother. It is possible that this is Ida, who was born in 1886 and who is alleged to have died in 1888, except that Dr. Bloch believes this girl's name was Clara. He may, however, be mistaken in this particularly, since both names end in an A, and he never had any close contact with her. There is no other mention of a Clara anywhere in the records. The younger sister Paula is also said to be a little on the stupid side, perhaps a high-grade moron. This is certainly a poor record, and one is justified in suspecting some constitutional weakness. A syphilitic taint is not beyond the realm of possibility. The mother died following an operation for cancer of the breast on December 21st, 1907. All biographers have given the date of her death as December 21st, 1908, but Dr. Bloch's records show clearly that she died in 1907, and John Gunther's record in the inscription of her tombstone corroborates this. The last 6 months of her life were spent in extreme pain, and during the last weeks it was necessary to give her injections of morphine daily. It is often alleged that she was of Czech origin and spoke only a broken German, and that consequently Adolf may have been ashamed of her among his playmates. This is almost certainly untrue. Dr. Bloch reports that she did not have any trace of an accent of any kind, nor did she show any Czech characteristics. Alois Hitler's first wife was of Czech origin, and later writers may have confused her with Adolf's mother. Siblings. Alois Jr. Alois Jr. was born on January 13, 1882, the illegitimate son of the father's second wife, but was born during the lifetime of the first wife. He is the father of William Patrick Hitler, one of our informants. He seems to have taken very much after his father in some respects. He left the parental home before the death of his father because, according to his son, he could no longer tolerate it. His stepmother, according to the story, made life very difficult for him and continually antagonized her husband against him. It seems that Alois Jr. had considerable talent for mechanical pursuits, and his father had planned on sending him to a technical school for training as an engineer. Until his third marriage, his father was very fond of his oldest boy, and all his ambitions were wrapped up in him. But the stepmother systematically undermined this relationship, and finally persuaded the mother that Alois Jr. was unworthy and that he should save his money for the education of her son, Adolph. She was finally successful, and Alois Jr. was sent away from home as an apprentice waiter. Evidently, the profession of waiter did not intrigue him, for in 1900 he received a 5-month sentence for thievery, and in 1902 he was sentenced to 8 months in jail for the same reason. He then went to London, where he obtained a position as a waiter, and in 1909 married Bridget Dowling, an Irish girl. In 1911, William Patrick Hitler was born, and in 1913 his father deserted the family and returned to Germany. The family was not a happy one, and broke up several times in the course of these 4 years. It is alleged that the father drank quite frequently, and then would come home and create tremendous scenes during which he frequently beat his wife and tried to beat the small infant. During these 4 years, when his mother and father had separated for a time, his father did go to Vienna. This would agree with Hafschnagel's conviction that Alois Jr. was in Vienna at the same time that Adolf was there. In 1924, Alois Jr. was brought before the court of Hamburg and charged with bigamy. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison, but since his first wife did not prosecute, the sentence was suspended. He has an illegitimate child by the second wife who lives in Germany. During all these years, he has never sent any money for the support of his first wife or child. Up until the time of the inflation, it is alleged that he had a very successful business in Germany. The business failed, and he has had various jobs up until 1934, when he opened a restaurant in Berlin, which became a popular meeting place for SA men. According to the son, Alois Jr. heartily disliked Adolf as a boy. He always felt that Adolf was spoiled by his mother, and that he was forced to do many of the chores that Adolf should have done. Furthermore, it seems that Adolf occasionally got into mischief with his mother, which his mother would blame on Alois, and Alois would have to take the punishment from his father. He used to say that as a boy he would have liked to have wrung Adolf's neck on more than one occasion, and considering the circumstances, this is probably not far from the truth. Since Hitler came to power, the two brothers have practically no contact with each other. They have come together a few times, but the meeting is usually unpleasant, with Adolf taking a very high-handed attitude and laying down the law to the rest of the family. Alois Jr. is not mentioned in Mein Kampf, and only a few people in Germany know of his relationship to Hitler. According to a newspaper report, he was sent to a concentration camp in 1942 because he talked too much. William Patrick Hitler. He is a young man of 32, the son of Alois Jr., who has not amounted to much. Before his uncle came to power, he worked as a bookkeeper in London. When his uncle became famous, he obviously expected that something would be done for his family. He gave up his job in London and went to Germany, where he had some contact with Adolf Hitler. The latter, however, was chiefly interested in keeping him undercover, and provided him with a minor job at the Opel automobile company. It is my impression that William Patrick was quite ready to blackmail both his father and his uncle, but that things did not work out as planned. He returned to England, and as a British subject came to this country, where he is a professional speaker. He is also engaged in writing a book about his associations and experiences in Hitler's Germany. Angela. She is an elder half-sister of Adolf. She seems to be the most normal one in the family, and from all reports is rather a decent and industrious person. During her childhood, she became very fond of Adolf, despite the fact that she had the feeling that his mother was spoiling him. She is the only one of the family with whom Adolf has any contact in later years, and the only living relative Hitler ever mentioned. When his mother died in 1907, there was a small inheritance which was to be divided among the children. Since the two girls had no immediate means of earning a livelihood, the brothers turned over their share to help the girls along. Adolf turned his share over to Angela, while Alois turned his over to a younger sister, Paula. Angela later married an official named Raubel in Linz, who died not long afterwards. She then went to Vienna, where, after the war, she was manager of the Mensa Academia Judaica. Some of our informants knew her during this time and report that in the student riots, Angela defended the Jewish students from attack, and on several occasions she beat the Aryan students off the steps of the dining hall with a club. She is rather large, strong peasant type of person who is well able to take an active part. After Adolf was discharged from the army at the close of the last war, it is alleged that he went to Vienna and visited Angela, with whom he had no contact in 10 years. While he was confined in Landsberg, she made the trip from Vienna to visit him. In 1924, she moved to Munich with her daughter, Geli, and kept house for Adolf. Later, she took over the management of Berchtesgaden. In 1936, friction developed between Adolf and Angela, and she left Berchtesgaden and moved to Dresden, where she married Professor Hamich. It is reported by William Patrick that the cause of the break was the discovery by Hitler that she was in a conspiracy with Goering to purchase the land adjoining Hitler's house at Berchtesgaden. This enraged Hitler to the extent that he ordered her from the house and has had little contact with her since. In any case, Adolf did not attend her second wedding. Geli Raubel. Hitler's relationship with Geli, Angela's daughter, has already been described in the previous section. She died in 1930. Leo Raubel. It has been generally assumed that Geli was the only child of Angela. William Patrick Hitler, however, reports that there was also a son named Leo. Not much is known of him except that he refused to have anything to do with his uncle Adolf after the death of Geli. He had a job in Salzburg and frequently came to Berchtesgaden to visit his mother when Hitler was in Berlin, but would leave soon just as the word was that Hitler was on his way there. According to William Patrick, he openly accused Hitler of causing Geli's death and refused to speak to him again as long as he lived. Word has been received that he was killed in 1942 while in the Balkans. Paula Hitler, or Heidler, is Adolf's real sister and is 7 years younger. What happened to her after her mother's death is a mystery, until she was discovered living very poorly in an attic in Vienna, where she has a position addressing envelopes for an insurance company. She now lives under the name Frau Wolf. Hitler's nickname is Wolf, and is alleged to be very queer and to receive no one in her home. Dr. Bloch went to visit her in the hope that she might intercede with her brother and obtain permission for him to take some money out of the country when he was exiled. He rapped on her door a number of times but received no answer. Finally, the neighbor on the same landing came to the door and asked who he was and what he wanted. The neighbor explained that Frau Wolf never received anyone and intimated that she was very queer. Other writers have also reported this. She promised, however, to deliver any message he might give to her. Dr. Bloch explained his predicament in detail. The next day when he returned, hoping that he would have an opportunity of speaking to Paula Hitler personally, the neighbor reported that Paula was very glad to hear from him and that she would do everything she could to help him, nothing more. During her childhood, according to William Patrick Hitler, she and Adolf did not get on very well together. There seems to have been considerable friction and jealousy between them, particularly since Alois Jr. was always taking her side. As far as is known, Hitler had no contact with her whatever from the time his mother died until 1933, when he became Chancellor. He has never mentioned her anywhere, as far as can be determined. It is alleged that he now sends her a small allowance each month to alleviate her poverty and keep her out of the limelight. According to William Patrick Hitler, his uncle became more interested in her as the friction with Angela increased. It is said that he has had her visit him at Berchtesgaden, and William Patrick met her at the Bayreuth Festival in 1939, where she went by the name of Frau Wolf, but Hitler did not mention to anyone that it was his sister. He said she is a little on the stupid side and not very interesting to talk to, since she rarely opens her mouth. This is Adolf Hitler's family, past and present. It is possible that there is another sister, Ida, an imbecile, who is still living, but if so, we have no knowledge of her whereabouts. On the whole, it is nothing to be proud of, and Hitler may be wise in keeping it well under cover. If we let our imaginations carry us back to the early 90s, it is not difficult to picture what life was like for Adolf in his earliest years. His father was probably not much company for his mother. Not only was he 23 years older, but it seems he spent most of his spare time in the taverns or gossiping with the neighbors. Furthermore, his mother knew only too well the past history of her husband, who was also her foster father, and one can imagine that for a 25-year-old woman, this is not what might be called a romantic marriage. Moreover, Clara Hitler had lost her first 2 children, and possibly a third, in the course of 3 or 4 years. Then Adolf arrived. Under these circumstances, it is almost inevitable that he became the focal point in her life, and that she left no stone unturned to keep him alive. All of the affection that normally would have gone to her husband and to her other children now became lavished on this newly born son. It is safe to assume that for 5 years little Adolph was the center of attraction in his home. But then a terrible event happened in Adolph's life. Another son was born. No longer was he the center of attraction. No longer was he the king of the roost. The newcomer usurped all of this, and little Adolph, who was on his way to growing up, was left to shift more or less for himself. At least, so it probably seemed to him. Sharing was something he had not learned up to this time, and it was probably a bitter experience for him, as it is for most children who have a sibling born when they are in this age period. In fact, in view of the earlier experiences of his parents, it is reasonable to suppose that it was probably more acute in his case than it is with the average boy. For 2 years he had put up with this sad state of affairs. Then matters went from bad to worse. A baby sister was born. More competition and still less attention for the baby sister and the ailing brother were consuming all of his mother's time while he was being sent off to school and made to take care of himself. 4 years later, tragedy again visited the Hitler household. When Adolf was 11 years old in 1900, his baby brother Edmund died. Again, we can imagine that Adolf reaped an additional harvest of affection and again became the apple of his mother's eye. This is certainly an extraordinary series of events which must have left their mark on Adolf's immature personality. What probably went on in his mind during these years we shall consider later on. It is sufficient at the moment to point out the extraordinary sequence of events and the probable effects they had on the members of the family and their relationships with each other. When Adolf was 6 years old, he was sent off to school. The first school was a very small Volksschule, where 3 grades met in the same room and were taught by the same teacher. In spite of the fact that he had to change schools several times in the course of the next few years, due to the fact that his father kept buying and selling his property and moving from one place to another, he seems to have done quite well in his studies. When he was 8 years old, he attended a Benedict monastery in Lambach. He was very much intrigued with all this. It gave him his first powerful impression of human achievement. At that time, his ambition was to become an abbot, but things did not work out very well. He was dismissed from the monastery because he was caught smoking in the gardens. His last year in Volksschule was in Leonding, where he received high marks in all his subjects, with the occasional exception of singing, drawing, and physical exercises. In 1900, the year his brother Edmund died, he entered the Realschule in Linz. To the utter amazement of all who knew him, his schoolwork was so poor that he failed and had to repeat the class another time. Then there was a gradual improvement in his work, particularly in history, freehand drawing, and gymnastics. In these subjects he was marked excellent several times. Mathematics, French, German, etc. remained mediocre, sometimes satisfactory, sometimes unsatisfactory. On effort he was regularly marked irregular. When he was 14 years of age, his father died suddenly. The following year he left the Realschule in Linz and attended the one in Steyr. We do not know why this change was made. Dr. Bloch is under the impression that he was doing badly toward the end of the year in the Linz school and was sent to Styria because it had the reputation of being easier. But his performance there was very mediocre. The only 2 subjects in which he excelled were freehand drawing, in which he was marked praiseworthy, and gymnastics, which he received the mark excellent. In the first semester, German language was unsatisfactory, and history it was adequate. All of this is beautifully glossed over in Hitler's description of these years. According to his story, he was at odds with his father concerning his future career as an artist, and in order to have his own way, he sabotaged his studies, at least those he felt would not contribute to an artist's career, and history, which he says always fascinated him. In these studies, according to his own story, he was always outstanding. An examination of his report cards reveals no such thing. History, even in his last year in Realschule, is adequate or barely passing, and other subjects which might be useful to an artist are in the same category. A better diagnosis would be that he was an outstanding in those subjects which did not require any preparation or thought, while in those that required application he was sadly lacking. We frequently find report cards of this type among our patients who are very intelligent but refuse to work. They are bright enough to catch on to a few of the fundamental principles without exerting themselves, and clever enough to amplify these sufficiently to obtain a passing grade without ever doing any studying. They give the impression of knowing something about the subject, but their knowledge is very superficial and is glossed over with glib words and terminology. This evaluation of Hitler's school career fits in with the testimony of former fellow students and teachers. According to their testimony, he never applied himself and was bored with what was going on. While the teacher was explaining new material, he read the books of Karl May, Indian and Wild West stories, which he kept concealed under the desk. He would come to school with Bowie knives, hatchets, etc., and was always trying to initiate Indian games in which he was to be the leader. The other boys, however, were not greatly impressed by him and his big talk or his attempts to play the leader. On the whole, they preferred to follow the leadership of boys who were more socially minded, more realistic in their attitudes, and held greater promise of future achievements than Hitler, who gave every indication of being lazy, uncooperative, and lived in a world of fantasy, talked big but did nothing of merit. He probably did not approve his standing with the other boys when, in his 12th year, he was found guilty of a Sittlichkeitsvergehen in the school. Just what the sexual indiscretion consisted of we do not know, but Dr. Block, who remembers that one of the teachers in the school told him about it, feels certain that he had done something with a little girl. He was severely censured for this and barely missed being expelled from school. It is possible that he was ostracized by his fellow students, and this is the reason he changed schools the following year. In September 1905, he stopped going to school altogether and returned to Leonding, where he lived with his mother and sister. According to his biographers, he was suffering from lung trouble during this period and had to remain in bed the greater part of the time. Dr. Block, who was the family doctor at this time, is at a loss to understand how this story ever got started because there was no sign of lung trouble of any sort. Adolph came to his office now and then with a slight cold or a sore throat, but there was nothing else wrong with him. According to Dr. Block, he was a very quiet boy at this time, rather slight in build, but fairly wiry. He was always very courteous and patiently waited for his turn. He made no fuss when the doctor looked into his throat or when he swabbed it with antiseptic. He was very shy and had little to say except when spoken to, but there was no sign of lung trouble. During this time, however, he frequently went with his mother to visit his aunt in Spital, Lower Austria, where he also spent vacations. The doctor who treated him there is alleged to have said to the aunt, quote, "From this illness Adolph will not recover," unquote. It has been assumed that he referred to a lung condition, but he may have been referring to something else entirely. In any event, Dr. Block is convinced that there were no indications of lung trouble a few months later when Adolph returned to Leonding. Although the mother's income was extremely modest, Adolph made no attempt to find work. There is some evidence that he went to a Munich art school for a short time during this period. Most of his time, however, was evidently spent in loafing around and daubing paints and watercolors. He took long walks into the hills, supposedly to paint, but it is reported that he was seen there delivering speeches to the rocks of the countryside in a most energetic tone of voice. In October 1907, he went to Vienna to prepare himself for the state examinations for admission as student to the Academy of Art. He qualified for admission to the examination, but failed to be accepted as a student. He returned home to Linz, but there was no indication that he communicated to anybody the results of the examination. It was undoubtedly a severe blow to him, for he tells us himself that he couldn't understand it. He was so sure he would succeed. At this time, his mother had already undergone an operation for cancer of the breast. She was failing rather rapidly, and little hope was held for her recovery. She died on September 21st, 1907, and was buried on Christmas Eve. To preserve a last impression, he sketched her on her deathbed. Adolph, according to Dr. Block, was completely broken. Quote, "In all my career, I have never seen anyone so prostrate with grief as Adolf Hitler," unquote. Although his sisters came to Block a very few days after the funeral and expressed themselves fully, Adolph remained silent. As the little group left, he said, "I shall be grateful to you forever." After the funeral, he stood at her grave for a long time after the sisters had left. The bottom had obviously fallen out of his world. Tears came into Dr. Block's eyes as he described the tragic scene. His mother would turn over in her grave if she knew what he turned out to be. This was the end of Adolf Hitler's family life.